Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight I'm settling into my cozy little Minecraft world while we dive into some absolutely wild revenge stories that'll help you drift off to sleep. I know, revenge stories for bedtime sounds counterintuitive, but there's something oddly satisfying about hearing how people got their perfect comeuppance right before you close your eyes. Plus, I've got my volume nice and low, the lighting's dim, and we're just going to let these stories wash over us like a gentle, vindictive lullaby. I've been scrolling through Reddit for hours finding the most satisfying revenge tales that people have shared. And honestly, some of these are so perfectly crafted, they almost sound too good to be true, but that's what makes them perfect for bedtime listening. Whether they're completely real or just beautifully written fiction, they're going to give you that warm, fuzzy feeling of justice being served. So grab your favourite blanket, get comfortable, and let's dive into some stories that'll make you believe karma really does come full circle. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that patience and a little creativity can be the most devastating combination. My upstairs neighbour has been making my life hell for 8 months, with his late-night parties, loud music, and stomping around at all hours. I work early shifts at the hospital, so I need to be asleep by 10 p.m. to function the next day. But every single night, without fail, this guy would crank up his stereo around 11 p.m. and have friends over until 3 or 4 in the morning. I tried talking to him politely multiple times. I explained my work schedule and asked if he could keep it down after 10 p.m. on weeknights. He'd nod and agree, then do the exact same thing the next night. So I called the landlord, who said he'd look into it but never followed through. I even called the police a few times, but by the time they showed up, he'd turn the music down and act innocent. The final straw came on a Sunday night when I had to work a double shift starting at 6 a.m. Monday. I was exhausted and desperately needed sleep, but at midnight he decided to have what sounded like a full house party. Bass thumping through my ceiling, people jumping around, shouting, laughing. I went upstairs and knocked on his door for 20 minutes. No answer. That's when I remembered something from my college physics class about resonant frequencies. Every building has natural frequencies that can cause vibrations to amplify dramatically. I did some research and found out that most apartment buildings constructed in the 1980s, like ours, have a resonant frequency around 8 to 12 Hz when you apply the right kind of rhythmic pressure. I ordered a very specific piece of equipment online. It's actually designed for construction work, a pneumatic concrete vibrator that contractors use to settle concrete. But with the right modifications and a timer system, it becomes something much more interesting. I spent 2 weeks carefully mounting this device to my ceiling, right below where his bedroom appeared to be based on the layout of my apartment. I soundproofed my own bedroom and moved my bed to the living room temporarily. Then I programmed the timer system. Every night at exactly 5 a.m, the device would activate for 30-minute intervals. It would send powerful, rhythmic vibrations up through the ceiling at the precise frequency needed to make his entire apartment shake. Not just shake, really shake, like earthquake-level vibrations concentrated in a small area. The first night it activated, I heard him stumbling around upstairs, clearly confused about what was happening. By night 3, I could hear him on the phone, probably calling the landlord about mysterious shaking in his apartment. By the end of the first week, he was knocking on doors asking other tenants if they felt earthquakes at 5 a.m. But here's the beautiful part. The device only affected his unit because of how I'd calculated the frequency and positioning. The apartments on either side of him experienced minor vibrations at worst, and because it operated at 5 a.m, when most people were either asleep or getting ready for work, nobody else really noticed or cared. Week 2 was when things got interesting. I could hear him moving furniture around, trying to figure out what was causing the shaking. He had maintenance people up there multiple times checking for structural issues, plumbing problems, anything that might explain the mysterious morning earthquakes. By week 3, he was clearly not sleeping well. The bags under his eyes when I saw him in the hallway were impressive. He'd gone from having loud parties every night to having no parties at all. Apparently, It's hard to convince friends to come over when your apartment randomly turns into a paint mixer every morning at 5 a.m. Week 4 was the breaking point. I heard him screaming at someone on the phone about the landlord not fixing whatever was wrong with his apartment. He demanded to be moved to a different unit or he'd break his lease. The landlord, who had ignored my noise complaints for months, suddenly became very motivated to solve his problem. The beautiful irony was that there was nothing actually wrong with his apartment. The vibrations were coming from below, and since I'd been the one complaining about him before, I was the last person anyone suspected of causing mysterious structural problems. He moved out at the end of that month. Before he left, he actually apologized to me for all the noise over the past months. He said he'd learned what it was like to have your sleep disrupted by things beyond your control, and he felt terrible about what he'd put me through. The new tenant who moved in is a quiet graduate student who keeps normal hours. We've never had a single noise issue. I dismantled my device and returned my bedroom to its normal configuration. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting creative. That story's absolutely brilliant. The amount of planning and scientific precision that went into that revenge is honestly impressive. Using physics and construction equipment to create targeted morning earthquakes is next-level petty, and I'm kind of in awe of the commitment. The fact that the neighbour actually apologised at the end makes it feel like a perfect redemption arc. Sometimes, when someone refuses to show basic courtesy, you have to get creative about teaching them empathy. Let's move on to our next story, which shows how sometimes the most satisfying revenge comes from simply letting someone's own actions catch up with them. I worked at a small marketing company where my boss, Patricia, was absolutely terrible to everyone, but especially seemed to have it out for me. She would micromanage every aspect of my work, criticize everything I did in front of other people, and take credit for my successful projects while blaming me for anything that went wrong. The worst part was her habit of scheduling mandatory meetings at 4:30 p.m. every Friday, and then keeping us there until 7 or 8 p.m, discussing things that could have been handled in a 5-minute email. She claimed these late Friday meetings were essential for team building and planning the next week, but really, she just seemed to enjoy having power over our personal time. Patricia also had this thing about being the smartest person in the room. She would interrupt presentations, correct people on minor details, and constantly reference her MBA from some mediocre business school she'd attended 15 years ago. She made it clear that she considered the rest of us beneath her intellectually. About 6 months into working there, I discovered something interesting. Our company had recently implemented a new project management software that tracked everything we did. Time spent on tasks, emails sent, documents created, meeting attendance, everything. Patricia had insisted on this system because she said she needed to monitor productivity and ensure everyone was pulling their weight. What Patricia didn't realise was that the system tracked her activity too. And since I was the one who had been tasked with generating the monthly productivity reports, I had access to everyone's data, including hers. The numbers were fascinating. While she was busy micromanaging everyone else and holding pointless meetings, Patricia was actually doing very little real work. She spent most of her time in meetings she had scheduled herself, sending emails about meetings or creating PowerPoint presentations about the importance of productivity. Her actual billable work for clients was less than half of what any other team member was producing. But the real revelation came when I looked at her email patterns. The system tracked when emails were sent and received, and I noticed something odd. Patricia would often send emails late at night or very early in the morning, clearly trying to create the impression that she was working around the clock. But the system also tracked when documents were actually created or modified. Those late-night emails she was sending, most of them were drafts she had written during normal business hours and scheduled to send later. She was literally staging her own workaholic performance. She'd write an email at 2 p.m, schedule it to send at 11 p.m, then act like she had been working late when people responded the next morning. I started documenting everything. Her actual work output, the time she spent in self-scheduled meetings versus productive work, the email scheduling patterns, everything. I didn't plan to do anything with this information initially. I just found it interesting to see the data behind her management style. Then Patricia made a critical mistake. During one of our Friday afternoon meetings, she announced that the company was implementing a new performance evaluation system. She said that going forward, our raises and job security would be based entirely on measurable productivity metrics. She claimed this was necessary because some team members weren't pulling their weight, and the data would reveal who was really contributing to the company's success. She spent 20 minutes in that meeting talking about accountability, work ethic, and how the numbers don't lie. She said that people who couldn't justify their productivity with hard data might need to find employment elsewhere. The whole time she was looking directly at me and two other team members she clearly wanted to get rid of. That's when I realised I had everything I needed. The next Monday, Patricia announced that she would be conducting individual performance reviews based on the productivity data. She scheduled mine for Friday afternoon, clearly planning to use the meeting to build a case for firing me. I spent that week preparing. I created a comprehensive presentation using the same project management software Patricia had insisted we implement. I pulled together 6 months of data showing productivity metrics for every team member, including detailed breakdowns of billable hours, project completion rates, client satisfaction scores, and work efficiency measurements. Friday arrived, and Patricia called me into the conference room with our HR representative present. She had a stack of papers in front of her and was clearly ready to present her case for why I was underperforming and needed to be let go. She started her presentation by talking about the importance of data-driven decision-making and how the numbers would speak for themselves. She pulled up my productivity metrics and began pointing out areas where she felt I was falling short. Then I asked if I could present my own analysis of the data. Patricia looked annoyed but agreed, probably thinking it would be entertaining to watch me try to defend myself. I started by showing the team's overall productivity numbers. Then I broke down individual contributions, starting with the highest performers and working my way down. I showed billable hours, successful project completions, client retention rates, and revenue generation per team member. Patricia's name appeared at the bottom of every single metric, but the real moment came when I showed the email analysis. I had created a chart showing the correlation between when emails were composed versus when they were sent. I explained how the system tracked document creation times and revealed patterns of scheduled email delivery designed to create false impressions of working hours. The HR representative was taking notes furiously. Patricia was getting redder and redder as I went through each slide. Then I showed the meeting analysis. I had calculated how much time each team member spent in meetings versus productive work. Patricia had spent 60% of her time in meetings she had scheduled herself, compared to an average of 15% for everyone else. Most of these meetings had no clear agenda or outcomes, and many could have been replaced with brief email communications. The final slide showed the cost analysis. Based on our salaries and time allocation, Patricia's management style was costing the company approximately $40,000 per quarter in lost productivity from unnecessary meetings and administrative overhead. Patricia tried to interrupt several times, but the HR representative asked her to let me finish my presentation. When I was done, there was complete silence in the room. Patricia started to speak, but the HR representative cut her off and said she needed to review all of this data with senior management before any personnel decisions were made. The following Monday, Patricia was called into a meeting with the company president and HR. By Wednesday, she had been placed on administrative leave pending further review. 2 weeks later, she was terminated for mismanagement and creating a hostile work environment. The company promoted one of my colleagues to the management position, implemented more reasonable meeting policies, and gave the entire team raises based on our actual productivity data. Patricia had been so focused on trying to prove that other people weren't working hard enough, that she created the perfect system to demonstrate her own incompetence. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving someone enough rope to hang themselves with, especially when they're the ones who insisted on providing the rope. This story is pure poetic justice. Patricia spent so much energy trying to micromanage and intimidate everyone else that she completely exposed her own lack of productivity. The fact that she demanded a data-driven performance evaluation system and then got destroyed by her own data is absolutely perfect. You can't fake work ethic when everything is being tracked, and trying to schedule emails to look like you're working late at night is just embarrassing. She literally built the framework for her own downfall. Our next tale involves someone who learned that messing with people's food is never a good idea, especially when your target has access to industrial kitchen equipment. I worked as a line cook at a high-end restaurant downtown, and we had this server named Brandon, who thought he was hot stuff because he made good tips and drove a nice car. Brandon had this nasty habit of eating food off customers' plates before delivering them to tables. Not just a French fry here and there, but actually taking bites out of steaks, scooping up portions of expensive appetizers, even drinking sips of wine before serving it. The kitchen staff complained to management multiple times, but Brandon was one of their top earners and had somehow convinced the general manager that we were just jealous of his success. He'd laugh about it openly, saying customers never noticed and that we were too uptight about food safety. Things escalated when Brandon started targeting my station specifically. I was the garde-manger, responsible for salads, cold appetizers, and dessert plating. Brandon would come by and grab handfuls of the expensive imported olives I used for antipasto plates, take spoonfuls of the house-made pâté, and even stick his fingers directly into dessert sauces I'd spent hours preparing. When I confronted him about it, Brandon just shrugged and said that's how restaurants work. He claimed he was quality testing everything to make sure it met his standards for his customers. He said if I didn't like it, I could find another job, because servers like him were the reason cooks like me had paychecks. The breaking point came on a busy Saturday night when I watched Brandon take a massive bite out of a $60 Wagyu steak before delivering it to a table celebrating their anniversary. The couple had specifically mentioned it was a special occasion when they ordered. I couldn't stand the thought of these people paying premium prices for food that had been contaminated by this guy's mouth. That's when I decided to get creative with my revenge. I knew Brandon's patterns. He always came by my station around 7 p.m. during the dinner rush to grab whatever looked good. So I started preparing special items just for him. Nothing dangerous or harmful, just extremely unpleasant surprises that would teach him to keep his hands off other people's food. The first trap was elegant in its simplicity. I prepared a small dish of what looked like expensive truffle oil for dipping bread. In reality, it was a mixture of olive oil and liquid smoke concentrates with a few drops of fish sauce. It looked identical to the real thing, but tasted like someone had mixed motor oil with rotting seafood. Brandon came by right on schedule, saw the beautiful little dish of oil with artisanal bread slices, and immediately grabbed a piece for a generous dip. I watched from the corner of my eye as he bit down, and his expression changed from smug satisfaction to absolute disgust. He spit it out immediately, gagging and coughing, but couldn't make a scene because we were in the middle of dinner service. For my second trap, I prepared what appeared to be a small portion of our signature chocolate mousse. In reality, it was a mixture of chocolate, mayonnaise, and wasabi that I'd carefully crafted to look identical to the real dessert. I even added the same garnish of candied orange peel and gold leaf that we used on the actual dish. Brandon couldn't resist. He grabbed a spoon and took a generous bite, probably expecting the rich, smooth chocolate flavour our mousse was famous for. Instead, he got a mouthful of creamy, chocolatey fire that burned his sinuses and coated his mouth with mayonnaise. He ran to the prep sink, desperately trying to rinse out his mouth, while tears streamed down his face from the wasabi burn. But my masterpiece came the following week. I knew Brandon had a particular weakness for our house-made ice cream, which we prepared in small batches using liquid nitrogen for texture. I prepared what looked like a scoop of our popular vanilla bean ice cream, but I'd actually used a mixture of vanilla, heavy cream, and pure capsaicin extract that I'd acquired from a specialty cooking supply company. The capsaicin extract was the kind of thing we used in microscopic amounts for certain molecular gastronomy techniques. A single drop could make an entire dish inedibly spicy. I used just enough to create an ice cream that looked completely normal, but would deliver the heat equivalent of eating a ghost pepper. Brandon approached my station with his usual arrogance, saw the perfect scoop of ice cream sitting in a small dish, and grabbed a spoon. He took a generous bite, probably expecting the cool, sweet relief of vanilla ice cream after a busy shift. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. The capsaicin activated as soon as the ice cream began to melt in his mouth. Brandon's eyes went wide, then he started making choking sounds. The cold temperature had initially masked the heat, but as everything warmed up, the full intensity hit him like a freight train. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe properly, and started running around the kitchen looking for something to put out the fire in his mouth. Milk, bread, ice water, nothing helped because capsaicin doesn't wash away easily. He was crying, sweating, and making sounds like a wounded animal. The entire kitchen staff stopped what they were doing to watch Brandon's meltdown. Some of the other cooks were trying not to laugh, while others looked genuinely concerned that he might need medical attention. Brandon spent the next 30 minutes in the employee bathroom, alternating between sticking his tongue under the faucet and sitting on the floor in misery. He missed the rest of his shift and had to call in sick the next day because his mouth was still burning. When he came back to work, Brandon was a changed person. He stopped stealing food from plates, stopped harassing the kitchen staff, and generally kept to himself during shifts. He never said anything directly about the ice cream incident, but everyone knew what had happened. The best part was that he couldn't complain to management without admitting he'd been stealing food, so he just had to suffer in silence and change his behaviour. A few weeks later, Brandon put in his 2 weeks' notice. He said he was pursuing other opportunities, but everyone knew he just couldn't handle working in a kitchen where the cooks had figured out how to fight back. The new server they hired to replace him was professional, respectful, and never once touched food that wasn't meant for him. Sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, or in this case, fight theft with capsaicin. Brandon learned the hard way that messing with people's food is a dangerous game when your targets have access to professional kitchen equipment and specialty ingredients. The fact that he couldn't even complain about getting his mouth set on fire because it would expose his own theft makes this absolutely perfect. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone who shows zero respect for food safety get taught a lesson they'll never forget. Let's move to our next story, which proves that sometimes the most devastating revenge comes from simply being better at someone's own game than they are. My roommate Chelsea thought she was a master manipulator who could get away with anything by playing innocent and making other people look like the bad guys. She had this whole routine down where she'd create problems, then act like the victim when people got upset about her behaviour. When we first moved in together, Chelsea seemed sweet and considerate. She'd leave little notes thanking me for cleaning the kitchen, offer to pick up groceries when she went shopping, and always asked before having friends over. I thought I'd lucked out with the perfect roommate situation, but after about 2 months, her real personality started showing. Chelsea would eat my food and then act confused when I asked about it, like she genuinely couldn't remember taking my leftovers or finishing my milk. When I'd get frustrated, she'd tear up and say she felt terrible, that she'd been so stressed with work that she wasn't thinking clearly, and promised to replace everything. She never replaced anything. Chelsea also had this habit of borrowing my clothes without asking. I'd come home to find my favourite sweater crumpled on her floor, or discover that my good jeans had mysterious stains on them. When confronted, she'd act shocked and claim she thought I'd said she could borrow them. She'd apologise profusely and promise to be more careful, then do the exact same thing the next week. The manipulation really ramped up when Chelsea started dating this guy named Trevor. Suddenly, he was at our apartment constantly, using our shower, eating our food, and treating the place like his second home. When I mentioned that having an unofficial third roommate wasn't what we'd agreed to, Chelsea broke down crying and said I was trying to sabotage her first healthy relationship in years. She called her mum while I was in the room, sobbing about how her roommate was being mean to her boyfriend and making her feel unwelcome in her own home. She painted me as this controlling, jealous person who couldn't stand to see her happy. Her mum actually called me later to lecture me about being more supportive of Chelsea's relationship. Things got worse when Chelsea started leaving messes everywhere and blaming them on me. She'd cook elaborate meals with Trevor, leave all the dishes in the sink for days, then act confused when I brought it up. She'd say she thought I had used those dishes too, and that she shouldn't have to clean up after both of us. The breaking point came when I discovered Chelsea had been going through my mail. She'd been opening packages addressed to me, using products I'd ordered, and then resealing the boxes to make it look like they hadn't been tampered with. When I caught her red-handed with a skincare product I'd ordered, she claimed she thought it was something she'd ordered and got delivered to the wrong room by mistake. That's when I realised I needed to document everything and beat Chelsea at her own manipulation game. I started by setting up a small security camera in the common areas of our apartment. It was completely legal since these were shared spaces, and I made sure it didn't point toward any private areas. I told Chelsea I was installing it for general security after some break-ins in the building, and she seemed fine with it. The camera captured everything. Chelsea eating my food, going through my packages, borrowing my clothes, even snooping through my personal items when she thought I wasn't home. But more importantly, it captured her rehearsing her innocent act in front of the mirror before confronting me about various issues. I also started keeping detailed records of everything. Photos of my food supplies before and after Chelsea's raids, screenshots of my online orders and delivery confirmations, receipts for everything I bought for the apartment. I created a spreadsheet tracking every incident with dates, times, and photographic evidence. But the most important thing I did was start recording our conversations. I used a voice memo app on my phone whenever Chelsea came to talk to me about apartment issues. I captured her admitting to things she'd later deny, making contradictory statements, and even practicing her victim routine. After 2 months of documentation, I had everything I needed for the perfect revenge. Chelsea's manipulation finally went too far when she decided to throw a party while I was out of town visiting family. She told everyone it was her apartment and that her roommate was just staying there temporarily. When I came home to find my furniture rearranged, my personal photos taken down, and evidence of a massive party I hadn't consented to, I knew it was time to act. Chelsea immediately went into victim mode. She cried about how she just wanted to celebrate her birthday with friends, how she tried to call me but couldn't reach me, and how she felt like I was treating her like a child instead of an equal roommate. She called her mum again, sobbing about how mean I was being about her birthday celebration. That's when I presented my evidence. I invited both our parents over for a mediation session to resolve our roommate conflicts. Chelsea was thrilled because she thought this would be her chance to convince everyone that I was the problem. She brought her mum, who came armed with a whole speech about how I needed to be more accommodating and understanding. I set up my laptop and started the presentation. First, I showed the security footage of Chelsea going through my packages, eating my food, and borrowing my clothes without permission. Then I played the audio recordings of her admitting to these behaviours in private conversations, followed by recordings of her denying the same behaviours when confronted. I showed the financial breakdown of everything Chelsea had used or consumed without replacing, which totalled over $800 in food, toiletries, and damaged clothing. I presented the photographic evidence of messes she'd left and blamed on me. But the coup de grace was the footage of Chelsea practicing her victim routine in front of the mirror. I had multiple recordings of her rehearsing crying, working on her facial expressions, and even practicing specific phrases she'd later use when confronting me about issues. The room went completely silent as everyone watched Chelsea literally rehearse her manipulation tactics like she was preparing for a performance. Her mum's expression went from righteous indignation to horror as she realised her daughter had been playing everyone, including her. My parents, who had been prepared to mediate a simple roommate dispute, were stunned by the level of calculated deception they were witnessing. Chelsea tried to explain, but every excuse she made just dug her deeper. She claimed the recordings were taken out of context, that I had manipulated the evidence, that she'd been joking around when she practiced those conversations in the mirror, but the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Her mum actually apologised to me for the phone call she'd made earlier and said she was embarrassed by her daughter's behaviour. My parents offered to help me find a new living situation if needed. Chelsea moved out 2 weeks later. She couldn't handle living with someone who had completely exposed her manipulation tactics to everyone who mattered to her. Before she left, she actually admitted that she'd never met anyone who was better at playing her own game than she was. The new roommate I found is honest, respectful, and actually contributes to keeping our shared space clean and comfortable. Sometimes the best way to deal with a manipulator is to out-manipulate them with nothing but the truth. This revenge is absolutely masterful because it uses Chelsea's own weapons against her. The security footage of her practicing her victim routine in the mirror is pure gold, especially when presented to her mum, who'd been defending her based on those same rehearsed performances. There's something deeply satisfying about watching a master manipulator get completely dismantled by simple documentation and truth-telling. Chelsea thought she was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers, but she didn't realise her roommate was actually playing 4D chess. Our next story involves someone who learned that trying to steal credit for other people's work can backfire spectacularly when you don't actually understand what you're stealing. I worked as a junior software developer at a tech startup, and my team lead was this guy named Vincent who had somehow convinced management that he was a coding genius despite barely being able to write basic HTML. Vincent had this habit of taking credit for everyone else's work during meetings, especially mine. The company was working on a major project for a client who wanted a custom inventory management system with real-time data analytics and machine learning predictions for stock optimization. It was complex stuff that required advanced algorithms and database architecture that, frankly, most of the team wasn't qualified to handle. I'd been working on machine learning models in my spare time for years, so I volunteered to tackle the predictive analytics component. I spent 3 months developing a sophisticated algorithm that could analyze sales patterns, seasonal trends, and external market factors to predict optimal inventory levels with 94% accuracy during testing. The system was beautiful. It used ensemble learning methods, combining multiple neural networks with gradient boosting algorithms. And I'd implemented a custom feature engineering pipeline that could process thousands of variables in real time. The client was blown away during the demo and immediately approved the project for full implementation. That's when Vincent struck. During the final presentation to the executive team, he took complete credit for the entire machine learning component. He used technical terms he'd clearly Googled, talked about how challenging it had been to develop the algorithms, and positioned himself as the technical genius who'd made the whole project possible. Management was impressed and Vincent got a promotion to senior team lead, along with a significant raise. Meanwhile, I was told that my contributions had been noted and I'd be considered for advancement in the future. I was furious but didn't know how to prove that the work was mine without seeming petty or causing drama that might hurt my career. Vincent was smart enough to have his name on all the final documentation, and he'd presented everything as his own work so convincingly that even some of my teammates seemed to believe it. That's when I realised Vincent had made a critical mistake. He'd claimed ownership of code he didn't actually understand. A few weeks after the presentation, the client requested some modifications to the predictive model. They wanted to add some additional variables and adjust the algorithm to account for supplier lead times and seasonal promotional impacts. It should have been straightforward for anyone who understood the underlying system. Vincent confidently told the client he'd handle the modifications personally and estimated it would take about a week. He assigned the task to himself in our project management system and told the rest of the team he'd be working independently on this critical update. I sat back and watched. 3 days into Vincent's supposed work on the modifications, he started looking panicked. I'd occasionally see him staring at my code on his screen with this expression of complete bewilderment. He'd Google random machine learning terms and frantically take notes, but it was obvious he had no idea what any of it meant. By day 5, Vincent was clearly desperate. He started asking seemingly casual questions about machine learning concepts, trying to get information without admitting he didn't understand the system he'd claimed to create. I gave him vague, unhelpful answers and suggested he check the documentation he'd supposedly written. The deadline arrived and Vincent had nothing. The client was expecting a demo of the updated system, and Vincent had to admit that he'd run into some technical complications and needed more time. The client was not happy, and management started asking pointed questions about why such a simple modification was taking so long. That's when Vincent made his fatal error. In a panic, he tried to modify the code randomly, hoping he could stumble onto a working solution. Instead, he completely broke the entire system. The predictive accuracy dropped to basically random chance, the real-time processing stopped working, and error messages started cascading throughout the application. The client called an emergency meeting for the next morning to discuss the system failures. Vincent looked like he hadn't slept in days and was clearly terrified about having to explain what had happened to the code he'd supposedly written. I let him sweat through the first part of the meeting as he tried to use technical jargon to explain problems he didn't understand. The client grew increasingly frustrated as Vincent's explanations made no sense, and he couldn't answer basic questions about his own alleged work. Finally, I spoke up. I told the client that I'd be happy to fix the system and implement their requested modifications. When they asked about my qualifications, I pulled up my personal GitHub repository, showing years of machine learning projects, my contributions to open source algorithms, and detailed documentation of every technique used in their system. Then I showed them the original code I'd written, complete with timestamps, version control history, and detailed comments explaining every function and algorithm. I demonstrated how Vincent's random modifications had broken specific components and walked them through exactly what needed to be fixed. The client immediately asked to speak with management privately. Within an hour, Vincent had been removed from the project, and I was appointed as the new technical lead with full authority over the machine learning components. But the real satisfaction came the next week when I had to present the fixed system to the executive team. I explained exactly what had gone wrong, showed the version control logs proving who had written what code, and demonstrated the restored functionality with the client's requested modifications successfully implemented. Vincent tried to claim that his modifications had been experimental and that breaking the system was part of his testing process. But when the CTO asked him to explain the specific algorithms he'd supposedly developed, Vincent couldn't answer basic questions about neural network architecture, gradient descent optimization, or ensemble learning methods. The investigation that followed revealed that Vincent had been taking credit for other people's work for months. Several team members came forward with their own stories of having their contributions stolen and rebranded as Vincent's innovations. Vincent was fired for misrepresentation and fraud. I got his promotion, his raise, and a formal apology from management for not recognizing my contributions sooner. The client was so impressed with the resolution that they signed a long-term contract for ongoing system development and maintenance. The best part was watching Vincent try to explain his supposed expertise during the exit interview when HR asked him to document his work for transition purposes. He literally couldn't describe the systems he'd claimed to build because he'd never understood them in the first place. Sometimes the most satisfying revenge is just giving someone enough rope to hang themselves with, especially when they're stealing rope they don't know how to use. That story is pure poetic justice. Vincent thought he could fake his way through advanced machine learning by memorizing buzzwords and taking credit for work he couldn't comprehend. The moment he actually had to modify the code, his complete lack of understanding became painfully obvious to everyone involved. There's something deeply satisfying about watching someone get destroyed by their own arrogance, especially when they've been stealing credit from the people who actually do the work. You can't fake expertise when the rubber meets the road, and Vincent learned that lesson the hard way in front of clients and executives. Let's dive into our next tale, which shows how sometimes the most effective revenge involves turning someone's own tactics against them in spectacular fashion. My sister-in-law Carmen has always been the type of person who thinks rules don't apply to her because she's somehow special or above consequences. She's one of those people who parks in handicapped spaces because she's just running in for a minute, cuts in line because her time is more valuable than everyone else's, and generally treats service workers like they're beneath her. The thing that drove me crazy was how she'd always get away with it because she was charming and manipulative when confronted. She'd apologise with this fake sincerity, claim she didn't realise she was doing anything wrong, and somehow make the other person feel bad for calling her out. This behaviour really ramped up after she married my brother-in-law and moved to our city. Suddenly she was showing up at family gatherings with stories about how she'd gotten out of speeding tickets by flirting with police officers, how she'd convinced restaurants to comp her meals by complaining about imaginary problems, and how she'd returned clearly used items to stores by acting confused and helpless. She treated it all like a game and seemed proud of her ability to manipulate situations to her advantage. My brother-in-law thought it was hilarious and would encourage her by laughing at her stories and calling her clever for gaming the system. The situation that finally pushed me over the edge happened at my daughter's birthday party. Carmen showed up 2 hours late after we'd already done cake and presents because she'd been getting her nails done. When my daughter was disappointed that Aunt Carmen had missed the important parts of her party, Carmen launched into this elaborate story about how the nail salon had messed up her appointment and she'd had to wait. Then she demanded that we redo the cake cutting so she could get photos for her social media. When I explained that we'd already cleaned up and my daughter was tired, Carmen threw a fit about how family should be accommodating and how she'd driven all this way just to celebrate. She actually convinced my mother-in-law to pressure me into bringing the cake back out and relighting the candles so Carmen could get her Instagram shots. My 7-year-old daughter had to fake excitement for a second round of birthday cake cutting because Aunt Carmen needed content for her followers. That's when I decided Carmen needed to experience what it felt like to be on the receiving end of her own manipulation tactics. I started by studying her methods. Carmen's whole approach relied on being charming and making other people feel like they were being unreasonable for enforcing normal boundaries. She'd create situations where saying no to her requests made you look petty or mean, even when her requests were completely inappropriate. The perfect opportunity came a few weeks later when Carmen announced she was throwing herself a birthday dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown. She'd made reservations for 12 people and expected everyone to split the cost of her meal, since she was the birthday girl. This was typical Carmen behaviour. She'd organise events that benefited her and then manipulate everyone else into paying for them. She'd done the same thing for her anniversary dinner, her promotion celebration, and even her housewarming party, where she'd registered for gifts online and sent the link to everyone. I RSVP'd for the dinner and started planning my revenge. First, I called the restaurant and explained that I wanted to surprise the birthday girl with a special cake. I arranged for them to present an elaborate custom cake during dessert, complete with sparklers and a singing presentation from the waitstaff. The cake cost $200, which I put on my credit card. Then I created a beautiful card, thanking Carmen for being such a generous host and for treating everyone to dinner for her birthday. I made it sound like she was paying for the entire meal as a gift to her family for celebrating with her. The night of the dinner arrived and everything went exactly as planned. Carmen held court all evening, talking about herself, showing off her outfit, and generally expecting everyone to fawn over her for existing another year. When dessert time came, the restaurant staff brought out the massive custom cake with sparklers blazing while singing happy birthday. Carmen was thrilled and immediately started taking selfies and videos for her social media. She thanked me profusely for the beautiful surprise and made a big show of how thoughtful and generous I was. Then the bill arrived. The server placed it directly in front of Carmen, as I'd arranged when I called ahead. The card I'd given her was sitting right next to her plate, clearly stating how wonderful it was that she was treating everyone to celebrate her special day. Carmen's face went white as she looked at the total. 12 people, expensive restaurant, wine, appetizers, entrees, and a $200 custom cake. The bill was over $800. She tried to laugh it off and suggest that everyone split the cost, like originally planned. But I immediately spoke up to thank her again for being such a generous host. I mentioned how unusual and thoughtful it was for someone to pay for their own birthday dinner, instead of expecting their guests to treat them. Other family members started chiming in, thanking Carmen for her generosity and talking about what a lovely gesture it was. My mother-in-law even got emotional about how mature and selfless Carmen was becoming. Carmen was trapped. She'd spent the entire evening accepting praise for her generosity, posed for photos with the expensive cake I'd ordered in her honor, and been publicly thanked multiple times for treating everyone to dinner. If she tried to back out now, she'd have to admit that she'd been planning to stick everyone else with the bill for her own birthday celebration. She'd look cheap, selfish, and manipulative in front of the entire family. She had no choice but to pay the full amount. I watched Carmen's face as she handed over her credit card with a forced smile, clearly calculating how much this evening was going to cost her. She'd been hoisted by her own petard, trapped by the same social manipulation tactics she used on everyone else. The best part was that she couldn't even complain about it later, without admitting that she'd never intended to pay for her own birthday dinner. She'd built her entire reputation on being charming and generous, and calling me out for the cake surprise would have revealed her true selfish nature to everyone. From that point forward, Carmen became much more careful about her manipulation tactics around me. She seemed to realize that I understood her playbook and was willing to use it against her when necessary. She still tries her entitled behavior with other people, but she's never again tried to stick me with the bill for her celebrations or manipulate me into accommodating her unreasonable demands. Sometimes the most effective way to deal with a manipulator is to out-manipulate them using their own methods. Carmen learned that evening what it feels like to be trapped by social expectations and forced to pay for someone else's agenda, which was exactly what she'd been doing to other people for years. Carmen got completely outplayed at her own game, and the beauty is she couldn't even complain about it afterward. Getting someone to pay $800 for their own birthday dinner by making them look generous in front of family is masterful psychological warfare. She spent years manipulating people with social pressure and fake charm, then got served the exact same treatment with a $200 cake garnish. The fact that she's still dealing with the consequences of her own tactics months later makes this revenge absolutely perfect. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that trying to sabotage a co-worker's career can backfire spectacularly when your target is more competent than you realized. I worked as a project manager at a mid-sized consulting firm, and there was this guy named Bradley who seemed to think that bringing other people down was the best way to advance his own career. Bradley was one of those people who would smile to your face during meetings but then send emails to management questioning your competence and suggesting that maybe you weren't the right fit for certain projects. The worst part was how subtle he was about it. Bradley never directly accused anyone of incompetence or made obviously malicious statements. Instead, he'd raise concerns about project timelines, suggest that certain team members might be overwhelmed, or recommend that management might want to double-check someone's work to ensure quality standards. It was death by 1,000 cuts, and Bradley had perfected the art of undermining people while maintaining plausible deniability. If anyone confronted him about his behaviour, he'd act shocked and claim he was just trying to ensure project success and client satisfaction. I became Bradley's primary target after I was assigned to lead a high-profile project with a major client. The project involved restructuring their entire operational workflow, and successful completion would likely lead to a promotion and a significant bonus. Bradley had wanted that assignment and clearly resented that I'd gotten it instead. The sabotage started immediately. Bradley would schedule conflicting meetings during my client presentations, send emails to my team members expressing concerns about my project timeline, and even contacted the client directly to offer additional support services that weren't part of our original scope. When I confronted him about the unauthorized client contact, Bradley claimed he'd just been networking and trying to strengthen the firm's relationship with an important client. He said he was surprised I'd interpret his proactive client service as anything negative. But the real escalation came when Bradley started spreading rumors that I was struggling with the project's complexity. He told colleagues that he'd noticed I seemed stressed and overwhelmed during meetings, suggested that maybe the project scope was too ambitious for someone with my experience level, and even recommended to management that they might want to assign him as a co-lead to ensure client satisfaction. The rumours started affecting my team's confidence in my leadership. People began second-guessing my decisions and looking to Bradley for confirmation on project directions. Some team members even started copying Bradley on emails that should have been internal team communications. I realised that Bradley's campaign was working. Management was starting to ask more detailed questions about my project progress, and I could sense doubt creeping into their interactions with me. If I didn't do something soon, Bradley would successfully undermine my position and potentially steal the project leadership role. That's when I decided to give Bradley exactly what he'd been asking for. I scheduled a meeting with management and explained that the project had grown in complexity beyond what I'd originally anticipated. I said that Bradley had been offering valuable insights and support, and I thought it would be beneficial to officially bring him onto the project as co-lead to ensure we exceeded client expectations. Management was pleased that I was being proactive about bringing in additional resources and immediately approved Bradley's assignment to the project. They praised my leadership for recognizing when to ask for help and commended Bradley for his willingness to take on additional responsibilities. Bradley was thrilled. He thought his sabotage campaign had worked perfectly and that he'd successfully maneuvered his way into a leadership position on the most important project of the quarter. What Bradley didn't realize was that I'd been documenting everything. Every unauthorized client contact, every undermining email, every attempt to poach my team members. I had a comprehensive record of his sabotage efforts, but more importantly, I had a plan to use his own tactics against him. As co-lead, Bradley now shared responsibility for the project's success or failure. But he'd spent so much time undermining the project that he'd actually created several problems that would need to be resolved. His unauthorized promises to the client had created scope creep that would be expensive and time-consuming to deliver. His interference with team communications had created confusion about project priorities and timelines. He assigned Bradley to handle all the issues he'd created. Since he'd promised the client additional services, he was responsible for developing and delivering those services within the original budget. Since he'd confused the team about priorities, he needed to create clear documentation resolving those conflicts. Bradley suddenly found himself responsible for fixing problems he'd created while trying to sabotage me, and he was completely unprepared for the actual work involved in project leadership. Within 2 weeks, it became obvious that Bradley had no idea how to manage the challenges he'd created. The additional services he'd promised to the client were poorly planned and over budget. His attempts to reorganize team priorities created more confusion and delays. His direct client communications were unprofessional and inconsistent with our firm's established protocols. Meanwhile, I focused on the core project deliverables that I'd been managing successfully before Bradley's interference. My portions of the project continued to meet deadlines and exceed quality standards, while Bradley's additions were clearly substandard and problematic. The client started complaining specifically about Bradley's contributions while praising the original project components I was handling. They requested that future communications go through me directly rather than Bradley, and they expressed concerns about the additional services that Bradley had promised but couldn't deliver effectively. Management quickly realized that bringing Bradley onto the project had created problems rather than solving them. They could see that the project had been running smoothly under my sole leadership and had only developed issues after Bradley's involvement. The final blow came when I presented my documentation of Bradley's sabotage efforts to management. I framed it as a post-project analysis of what had gone wrong and how similar issues could be prevented in the future. I showed how Bradley's unauthorized client contacts had created scope creep, how his team interference had caused delays, and how his undermining communications had damaged team morale and efficiency. I presented it all very professionally, focusing on process improvements rather than personal accusations. But the evidence was overwhelming and clearly demonstrated a pattern of deliberate sabotage disguised as helpful collaboration. Bradley was removed from the project immediately and placed on performance improvement planning. Management apologized for not recognizing his disruptive behavior sooner and commended me for handling the situation professionally despite significant provocation. The project was completed successfully under my sole leadership. The client was extremely satisfied with the results, and I received both the promotion and bonus that had originally been at stake. Bradley's reputation in the company never recovered. Everyone now knew about his sabotage tactics, and other project managers refused to work with him. He was passed over for promotions repeatedly and eventually left the company when it became clear his career there was permanently stalled. The beautiful irony was that Bradley had gotten exactly what he'd been asking for. He'd wanted to be involved in high-profile projects and share leadership responsibilities. But when he finally got those opportunities, he proved that he was completely unprepared for the actual work involved and only capable of tearing other people down rather than building anything himself. Bradley thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers, but he didn't realize that sometimes the best way to beat a saboteur is to give them exactly what they want and let them destroy themselves with their own incompetence. The rope he'd been weaving to hang me with became his own noose when he actually had to deliver results, instead of just creating problems for other people. This is absolutely brilliant because Bradley essentially sabotaged himself by getting what he thought he wanted. He spent so much energy creating problems to make his target look bad that when he finally got promoted to fix those same problems, he was completely out of his depth. The documentation strategy was perfect too, turning all his undermining tactics into evidence of his own incompetence. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving someone enough responsibility to prove they can't handle it. This next story involves someone who learned that trying to cheat the system works great until you encounter someone who understands the system better than you do. I worked at a small insurance company where this woman named Veronica had figured out how to game our expense reimbursement system. She'd submit receipts for business meals that were actually personal dinners, claim mileage for trips she never took, and even expense personal items by claiming they were office supplies. Veronica was smart about it though. She never got too greedy with individual claims, and she spread her fake expenses across different categories so nothing looked suspicious. She'd submit a fake lunch receipt for $30 here, claim 20 miles of business travel there, expense a pack of pens that was actually mascara somewhere else. Over the course of a year, she was probably stealing around $3,000, but in small enough increments that it flew under the radar. The thing that made me suspicious was how Veronica always seemed to have extra money, despite making the same salary as everyone else. She'd show up with expensive coffee every morning, wore designer clothes that were way above our pay grade, and was always talking about the fancy restaurants she'd been trying. When people asked how she could afford her lifestyle, she'd just say she was really good at budgeting and finding deals. I worked in the accounting department, so I processed everyone's expense reports. After a few months of handling Veronica's submissions, I started noticing patterns. Her business meal receipts were always from restaurants near her apartment, never near client offices. Her mileage claims were often for routes that didn't make sense for actual business travel. Her office supply expenses included items that never seemed to appear in our supply closet. But what really confirmed my suspicions was when I recognized one of her receipts. Veronica had submitted a dinner receipt, claiming it was a business meal with a potential client. The receipt was from a restaurant where I'd seen her having a romantic dinner with her boyfriend the week before. She'd been celebrating their anniversary, posting photos on social media, and clearly wasn't conducting any business meetings. That's when I started paying closer attention to all of her submissions. I cross-referenced her claimed business meetings with our client database and found that half the companies she claimed to be meeting with weren't even our clients. Her mileage logs included trips on days when I knew she'd called in sick. Her office supply receipts had timestamps showing purchases made on weekends when our office was closed. I documented everything for about 6 months, building a comprehensive case showing Veronica's systematic fraud. But instead of reporting her immediately, I decided to use her own tactics against her in a much more creative way. I created a fake expense report in Veronica's name for a business trip that never happened. I made up a client meeting in a city 3 hours away, complete with hotel receipts, meal expenses, and mileage claims. The total was for about $800, which was larger than Veronica's usual individual claims, but not so large as to be obviously suspicious. Then I submitted the fake report through the same channels Veronica used, making it look like she'd filed it herself. I used her login credentials, which I'd observed her entering multiple times, and made sure the formatting and language matched her previous submissions. The fake report sailed through the initial approval process, just like all of Veronica's previous fraudulent claims. But here's where my plan got interesting. I'd specifically designed the fake trip to include several details that could be easily verified and would immediately reveal the fraud if anyone looked closely. The hotel receipt was from a hotel that had been closed for renovations during the dates of the supposed trip. The restaurant receipts were from establishments that didn't exist at the claimed locations. The mileage log showed travel on a day when Veronica had actually been in the office, attending a mandatory all-staff meeting with dozens of witnesses. A week after the fake report was processed, I submitted an anonymous tip to our internal audit department. I expressed concerns about potential expense report fraud and suggested they might want to review recent submissions from certain employees. I didn't name Veronica specifically, but I provided enough information to point them in the right direction. The audit team started with the most recent expense reports, which meant they examined my fake submission first. Within hours, they'd identified all the red flags I'd built into the fraudulent report: the closed hotel, the non-existent restaurants, the impossible timeline. Everything immediately screamed fraud. But when they called Veronica in to explain the discrepancies, she couldn't provide any reasonable explanations because she'd never actually filed the report or taken the trip. She had no memory of the supposed client meeting, no backup documentation, and no way to account for the $800 that had been deposited into her account. Veronica's immediate response was to claim that someone else must have filed the report using her credentials. This prompted the audit team to expand their investigation to all of her previous expense submissions. They wanted to determine if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of fraudulent activity. That's when they discovered everything. 6 months of fake receipts, impossible mileage claims, non-existent client meetings, and systematic theft totaling over $3,000. The audit revealed that Veronica had been running an elaborate expense fraud scheme for almost a year. But the beautiful part was that Veronica couldn't claim innocence about the previous fraud without admitting that she'd lied about not filing the fake report that triggered the investigation. If she acknowledged that someone else had access to her credentials and could file false reports, then all of her previous submissions became suspect. If she maintained that she was responsible for all her expense reports, then she was admitting to the fraud. She was trapped by her own system of deception. The company fired Veronica immediately and pressed criminal charges for embezzlement. She had to pay back all the stolen money plus penalties and ended up with a criminal record that made it nearly impossible to find work in the financial sector. The most satisfying part was watching Veronica try to explain to the police how someone could have filed fake expense reports in her name when she'd been so careful about protecting her login credentials. She couldn't admit that her security was lax without undermining her entire defense, but she also couldn't explain how the fraud had occurred if her credentials were truly secure. Veronica had spent months perfecting a system to steal money from the company, but she'd never considered that the same system could be used to destroy her. She'd gotten so comfortable with filing fraudulent reports that she couldn't distinguish between her own fake submissions and someone else's fake submission designed to expose her. Sometimes the most effective way to catch a thief is to use their own methods to set a trap they can't escape from. Veronica learned that when you build a career on deception, eventually that deception becomes a prison of your own making. That story is absolutely diabolical in the best possible way. Using someone's own fraud system to create a fake report that exposes their entire operation is pure genius. Veronica got caught in a logical trap where any explanation she gave would incriminate her further. The fact that she'd been so careful and methodical about her theft made it impossible for her to defend herself when the tables turned. Sometimes the most elaborate schemes fall apart because they're too complicated for their creators to navigate when questioned. And that's where we'll pause tonight's collection of revenge stories. These tales of perfectly orchestrated payback should give you plenty to think about as you drift off to sleep. There's something deeply satisfying about hearing how people who thought they were untouchable got exactly what they deserved through their own actions and choices. Whether it was the neighbour who learned about resonant frequencies the hard way, the food thief who got a mouthful of capsaicin, or the expense fraud mastermind who got trapped by her own system. Each story shows that patience, creativity, and a little bit of strategic thinking can lead to the most satisfying forms of justice. Sweet dreams, everyone, and remember that sometimes the best revenge is simply giving people enough rope to hang themselves with. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time with more stories that prove karma really does have a sense of humour. I worked at a high-end spa where the owner, Patricia, had this twisted obsession with making sure employees knew their place in her little kingdom. She'd make us clock out for bathroom breaks, deduct pay if we were even 2 minutes late, and had security cameras everywhere to monitor our every move. The woman treated us like we were her personal servants rather than licensed massage therapists and estheticians. The breaking point came when Patricia implemented what she called the appearance standards policy. She said that as representatives of her luxury brand, we needed to maintain a certain level of physical perfection. This meant mandatory weigh-ins every Monday morning, requirements to get our hair and nails done at specific salons she'd chosen, and even rules about what kind of makeup we could wear. If you didn't meet her standards, she'd cut your hours, or assign you to work the graveyard shift cleaning treatment rooms instead of seeing clients. She justified everything by saying that wealthy clients expected to be served by people who embodied the spa's commitment to beauty and wellness. Patricia took particular pleasure in humiliating employees in front of customers. She'd loudly criticize our appearance, question our techniques during treatments, and even interrupt sessions to point out things we were supposedly doing wrong. Clients would leave feeling uncomfortable, and we'd lose tips because Patricia had made the entire experience awkward. The revenge opportunity came when Patricia decided to expand the business by opening a second location. She was courting this incredibly wealthy investor who was known for being very particular about the businesses he funded. This guy had a reputation for doing extensive background research and only investing in companies with impeccable reputations and ethical business practices. I knew that Patricia's treatment of employees would be a deal breaker for this investor, but I also knew he'd never see her true behavior during a formal business meeting. So I got creative about making sure he got the full Patricia experience. I found out when Patricia was scheduled to give the investor a tour of the spa, and I arranged for several former employees to book appointments during that exact time slot. These were therapists and estheticians who had quit because of Patricia's abuse, and they were more than happy to help expose her true nature. The plan was simple. Each former employee would book a service and then create situations that would trigger Patricia's worst behavior in front of the investor. They'd arrive slightly late, ask questions about treatments, and generally act like normal customers who needed guidance and patience. The day arrived and everything unfolded perfectly. The first former employee showed up 10 minutes late for her facial appointment, while Patricia was giving the investor a tour of the treatment rooms. Instead of handling it professionally, Patricia immediately launched into a public tirade about punctuality and respect for other people's time. She berated the front desk staff for accepting the late appointment, criticized the esthetician for not being prepared to adjust the schedule, and made several comments about how some people just don't understand the value of a luxury experience. The investor watched this entire meltdown with obvious discomfort. The second trigger came when another former employee asked detailed questions about the products being used during her massage. Instead of viewing this as an engaged customer showing interest in the spa's offerings, Patricia treated it like a personal attack on her business model. She interrupted the treatment to lecture the customer about trusting the professionals and not questioning their expertise. She made condescending comments about how some people think they know better than licensed therapists with years of training. The massage therapist looked mortified as Patricia essentially told a paying customer to shut up and stop asking questions. But the masterpiece was the third appointment. A former employee had booked a couple's massage with her boyfriend, and they'd coordinated to create the perfect storm of Patricia's pet peeves. They arrived exactly on time, but asked to modify their service slightly, requested information about ingredients in the products, and mentioned they were considering booking services for their upcoming wedding. Patricia completely lost her mind. She went on this rant about entitled customers who think they can customize everything to their personal preferences. She complained about people who waste time with unnecessary questions when they should just trust the professionals. She even made comments about how the wedding industry has created unrealistic expectations for service providers. The investor witnessed all of this while Patricia was supposed to be impressing him with her customer service excellence and business acumen. Instead, he saw her verbally abuse staff members, dismiss customer concerns, and create an atmosphere of tension and discomfort throughout the entire facility. By the end of the tour, 3 different paying customers had left without completing their services. 2 employees were visibly upset, and the entire spa felt like a hostile work environment rather than a relaxing retreat. The investor thanked Patricia for her time and left without making any commitments. Within a week, word had spread through the local business community about Patricia's behavior during the tour. The story became a cautionary tale about how not to treat employees and customers, and Patricia's reputation in the industry was permanently damaged. She never got the funding for her second location, and within 6 months, several of her best employees had left for competitors. The spa's online reviews started reflecting the toxic work environment as former employees shared their experiences and business declined significantly. Patricia eventually had to sell the spa at a loss and left town. The new owners immediately changed the policies, treating employees with respect and focusing on creating genuinely positive experiences for both staff and customers. The best part was that Patricia never figured out that her downfall had been orchestrated by the very employees she'd spent years abusing. She blamed the failed investment on the investors' unrealistic expectations and claimed that people just didn't understand her commitment to excellence. Sometimes the most effective revenge is simply giving someone an audience for their worst behaviour and letting them destroy themselves with their own toxicity. That story is absolutely perfect because Patricia literally sabotaged herself by being exactly who she really was when it mattered most. The coordinated effort by former employees to trigger her worst impulses during the investor tour is chef's kiss-level planning. She spent years abusing people thinking there would never be consequences, then destroyed her own business expansion by throwing public tantrums in front of the one person who could make or break her future. The fact that she blamed everyone except herself for the failure makes it even more satisfying. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that trying to steal a promotion through office politics can backfire spectacularly when your target documents everything. I worked in the marketing department of a mid-sized company, and there was this woman named Brenda who had convinced herself that she deserved every promotion, raise, and opportunity that came available. The problem was that Brenda's work quality was mediocre at best, but she made up for it by being incredibly skilled at taking credit for other people's successes and deflecting blame for her own failures. Brenda had this whole system worked out where she'd volunteer to collaborate on high-visibility projects, then position herself as the lead contributor when presenting results to management. She'd speak first in meetings, use confident language about her strategies and her analysis, and somehow make it seem like other people had just been helping implement her vision. The real issue started when a senior marketing manager position opened up. It was a significant promotion with a substantial salary increase, and everyone knew it would likely go to either me or Brenda since we had the most relevant experience. I'd been with the company longer and had a stronger track record of successful campaigns, but Brenda had been more visible with management due to her self-promotion tactics. That's when Brenda's sabotage campaign began in earnest. She started scheduling meetings with key stakeholders during times when I was unavailable, making it look like I wasn't engaged with important projects. She'd send follow-up emails summarizing these meetings that positioned her as the primary point of contact and decision-maker, while making it seem like I was just peripherally involved. Brenda also began subtly undermining my work during team meetings. She'd ask pointed questions about my project timelines, suggest that my strategies might be too risky for conservative clients, and offer to take on additional responsibilities to ensure quality standards were met. She was essentially campaigning for the promotion by making me look unreliable and herself look indispensable. The final straw came when I discovered that Brenda had been taking credit for a major campaign I'd developed entirely on my own. She'd presented my strategy to the executive team as her own work, complete with my research, my creative concepts, and my implementation timeline. When the campaign succeeded and generated significant new business, Brenda positioned herself as the mastermind behind the company's marketing breakthrough. That's when I realized I needed to fight back, but I decided to use Brenda's own tactics against her in a much more systematic way. I started documenting everything, every email exchange, every meeting where Brenda took credit for other people's work, every instance of her undermining colleagues or misrepresenting project contributions. I created a detailed timeline showing patterns of behavior that went back over 2 years. But more importantly, I began setting traps. I knew Brenda couldn't resist taking credit for successful projects, so I started creating situations where her theft would be impossible to deny. I developed a marketing proposal for a potential new client, but instead of sharing it through normal channels, I only discussed it in a meeting where I made sure to have detailed notes and witnesses. I presented it as a preliminary concept that I was still developing and asked for input from the team. Brenda immediately started suggesting modifications and improvements, trying to insert herself into the creative process. But I made sure that all her suggestions were documented with timestamps and attribution, so there would be a clear record of who contributed what to the final proposal. Then I scheduled a presentation to management, where Brenda would have the opportunity to present our collaborative work to the executive team. I knew she wouldn't be able to resist positioning herself as the lead contributor, especially with such a high visibility opportunity. The presentation went exactly as predicted. Brenda spoke first, outlined the strategy as if it was primarily her creation, and took credit for the research and analysis I'd spent weeks developing. She presented my work confidently and competently, making it clear to everyone in the room that she considered herself the architect of the entire proposal. That's when I played my hand. I thanked Brenda for her presentation and mentioned that I'd like to add some context about the development process. Then I pulled out my documentation, showing the complete timeline of how the proposal had been created. I showed emails proving that I'd developed the initial concept independently, meeting notes demonstrating that Brenda's contributions had been minor suggestions rather than foundational elements, and timestamps showing that the bulk of the work had been completed before Brenda was even involved in the project. But the real revelation came when I presented my evidence of Brenda's pattern of taking credit for other people's work. I showed multiple instances where she'd appropriated colleagues' ideas, research, and strategies, presenting them as her own contributions to various projects. The executive team was stunned. They'd been impressed by what they thought was Brenda's innovative thinking and leadership potential, but now they realised that most of her apparent successes had been built on stolen work from other team members. The investigation that followed revealed that Brenda had been systematically taking credit for other people's contributions for years. Multiple colleagues came forward with their own stories of having their work appropriated and their contributions minimised in favour of Brenda's self-promotion. Not only did Brenda not get the promotion, she was placed on performance improvement planning and eventually terminated for misrepresenting her contributions to company projects. The promotion went to me along with a formal apology from management for not recognising the true source of the work they'd been praising. The most satisfying part was that Brenda had been hoisted by her own petard. Her compulsive need to take credit for successful projects had made her predictable and easy to trap. She'd walked directly into a situation where her theft was documented and undeniable, and she'd done it in front of the very people she'd been trying to impress. Brenda had spent years building a reputation based on other people's work, but when she finally got caught, that entire house of cards collapsed in a single meeting. Sometimes the best way to expose a fraud is to give them exactly the kind of opportunity they can't resist, and then document everything they do with it. The poetic justice here is incredible, because Brenda literally stole her way into exposing herself. She was so addicted to taking credit for other people's work that she walked straight into a trap designed around that exact weakness. Watching someone's entire career crumble because they couldn't resist one more theft is deeply satisfying. The systematic documentation turning her own tactics against her makes this revenge absolutely perfect. Let's move to this next story, which shows how sometimes the most devastating revenge comes from simply letting someone's own arrogance destroy them. I lived in a small apartment complex where the property manager, Richard, had developed a serious power complex about his role. This guy treated being in charge of a 12-unit building like he was running a major corporation, and he made life miserable for every tenant with his arbitrary rules and constant harassment. Richard had created all these unofficial policies that went way beyond what was in our lease agreements. He'd fine people for having guests stay overnight more than twice a month, charge extra fees for packages being delivered to the building, and even tried to regulate when tenants could do laundry or take showers to avoid overloading the building's utilities. The worst part was how he'd conduct surprise inspections of apartments under the guise of maintenance checks. Richard would let himself into units without proper notice, go through personal belongings, and then create violation notices for things like having too many houseplants or storing personal items in closets he deemed overcrowded. He particularly seemed to enjoy targeting tenants he perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to fight back. College students, elderly residents, and anyone who seemed intimidated by his authority would get extra scrutiny and harassment. He'd threaten eviction over minor issues and use scare tactics to make people comply with his made-up rules. The situation escalated when Richard decided that my apartment was too cluttered and that I needed to remove half of my furniture to meet his aesthetic standards. He claimed that overcrowding was a fire hazard and that he had the authority to regulate how tenants arranged their personal belongings. When I pointed out that nothing in my lease gave him the right to dictate my interior decorating choices, Richard threatened to start eviction proceedings for violation of building safety standards. He said he'd been documenting problems with my tenancy and that I was already on thin ice with management. That's when I decided to research exactly what Richard's actual authority was versus what he claimed it was. It turns out that Richard had been operating way outside his legal boundaries for years. Property managers have specific limitations on when they can enter apartments, what kinds of fees they can charge, and how they can enforce lease agreements. Most of Richard's pet rules and policies were completely unenforceable and potentially illegal. More importantly, I discovered that the building was owned by a large property management company that had very specific protocols for how their employees were supposed to interact with tenants. Richard's harassment tactics and unauthorized inspections were direct violations of company policy and could expose them to significant legal liability. I started documenting everything, every unauthorized entry, every made-up fee, every threat of eviction over non-existent lease violations. I also reached out to other tenants and discovered that Richard had been harassing everyone with similar tactics for months. But instead of just filing a complaint, I decided to let Richard's own arrogance be his downfall. I knew that Richard's power complex made him incapable of backing down from confrontation, especially when he thought he was dealing with a tenant who didn't understand their rights. So I baited him into escalating his harassment to the point where it would be impossible for his employers to ignore. I started by politely questioning his authority in writing. I sent emails asking for clarification about which lease provisions gave him the right to regulate my furniture arrangements, charge fees for package deliveries, and conduct surprise inspections of my personal belongings. Richard's response was exactly what I'd hoped for. Instead of backing down or consulting with his supervisors, he doubled down on his authority claims. He sent me a lengthy email outlining all the ways he could make my life difficult if I continued to question his management decisions. He threatened immediate eviction, claimed he had the right to enter my apartment whenever he deemed necessary, and even suggested that tenants who didn't appreciate his management style were welcome to find housing elsewhere. More importantly, Richard copied the building owner's corporate office on his response, apparently thinking that involving his superiors would intimidate me into compliance. He had no idea that his email was creating a paper trail of policy violations that would be impossible to defend. I forwarded Richard's threatening email to the corporate office, along with my documentation of his unauthorized activities and a formal complaint about harassment and intimidation. I also included testimonials from other tenants who had been subjected to similar treatment. The response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours, a representative from the corporate office was on site conducting an investigation into Richard's management practices. They interviewed multiple tenants, reviewed building records, and discovered a pattern of policy violations and potential legal liability. Richard was terminated immediately. The company issued formal apologies to affected tenants, refunded unauthorized fees, and implemented new policies to prevent similar harassment in the future. But the most satisfying part was learning what had actually triggered Richard's termination. According to the corporate representative, it wasn't just the harassment complaints or policy violations. It was the fact that Richard had been so arrogant in his response to my questions that he'd essentially confessed to violating company policy in writing while copying his supervisors on the email. Richard had been so convinced of his own authority that he'd documented his misconduct and delivered the evidence directly to the people who had the power to fire him. His arrogance had literally created the paper trail that ended his career. The new property manager is professional, respectful, and actually follows the lease agreements instead of making up arbitrary rules. The entire building atmosphere improved overnight once Richard's reign of terror ended. Richard had spent months terrorizing tenants with fake authority, but when someone finally challenged him to prove that authority existed, he exposed his own fraudulent behavior to the very people he was supposed to be accountable to. Sometimes the most effective revenge is just asking someone to justify their actions to the people who actually have power over them. That's the end of that story. Richard literally fired himself by being too arrogant to know when to shut up. The fact that he copied his own bosses on an email where he confessed to violating company policy is absolutely perfect. He was so drunk on his imaginary power that he handed his employers a written confession of his misconduct. Sometimes the best revenge is just giving someone enough rope and watching them tie their own noose while thinking they're lassoing you. This next story comes from someone who discovered that their roommate had been stealing from them for months and decided to get creative with their response. I lived with my roommate Alex for about 8 months before I realized he'd been stealing my groceries. At first I thought I was just being forgetful or eating more than I remembered. But when my expensive imported coffee kept disappearing and my specialty cheeses vanished overnight, I knew something was up. I set up a small camera in the kitchen while Alex was at work, hidden behind some cookbooks on top of the fridge. What I discovered over the next week made my blood boil. Alex wasn't just taking a little here and there, he was systematically going through my food, eating my leftovers, using my condiments, and even taking my meal prep containers to work for his lunches. The breaking point came when I watched him eat an entire cake I'd made for my girlfriend's birthday. I'd spent hours on that thing, and he just cut himself slice after slice while watching TV. When I got home that evening, Alex looked me straight in the eye and said he had no idea what happened to the cake. Maybe it went bad and I should check the trash. That's when I decided Alex needed to learn a lesson about respecting other people's property. I went to the grocery store and bought ingredients for another cake, but this time I made some special modifications. I used salt instead of sugar, replaced the vanilla extract with apple cider vinegar, and added a generous amount of cayenne pepper to the chocolate frosting. The final touch was a layer of wasabi mixed into the cream filling. I made sure to leave the cake in the same spot as before, with a note that said, "For Sarah's office party, do not touch," taped to the box. Then I waited. The next morning I heard the most horrific, retching sounds coming from the kitchen. Alex was hunched over the sink, frantically trying to wash the taste out of his mouth, while tears streamed down his face. His face was bright red, and he kept making these weird gasping noises between spitting into the sink. When he saw me, he started yelling about how I'd tried to poison him. I calmly explained that the cake was clearly marked as off-limits, and maybe if he'd respected that boundary, he wouldn't be experiencing what I called natural consequences. But I told him I'd been documenting his theft for weeks and had video evidence of him stealing my food. Alex tried to argue that roommates sharing food was normal, but I pulled out my phone and showed him a compilation video I'd made of all his theft. There he was, eating my pizza at midnight, finishing my orange juice straight from the container, and yes, devouring the entire birthday cake I'd made for someone else. The confrontation escalated when Alex threatened to call the police about the poisoned cake. I pointed out that calling the police would mean admitting he'd stolen clearly marked food that didn't belong to him. and that my special ingredients were all perfectly legal food items. I also mentioned that I had documentation of hundreds of dollars worth of groceries he'd stolen over the months. Alex moved out 2 weeks later, but not before I presented him with an itemized bill for all the food he'd taken. I'd calculated the cost of every meal, every snack, every condiment, and even the electricity used to refrigerate the items he'd stolen. The total came to just over $400. He initially refused to pay, claiming I was being ridiculous and vindictive, so I told him I'd be happy to take the matter to small claims court, where I'd present my video evidence and detailed expense records. I also mentioned that I'd reached out to his workplace HR department to let them know he'd been bringing stolen food for his work lunches, since technically that made him a thief in a professional environment. Alex paid me the full amount the next day and couldn't make eye contact during the entire transaction. He also left behind about $50 worth of groceries that I'm pretty sure he'd bought as some kind of peace offering, though he never actually apologized. The best part was that after he moved out, I found out from our mutual friends that Alex had been complaining to everyone about his crazy roommate who tried to poison him. But when people asked for details, his story fell apart pretty quickly. Hard to maintain the victim narrative when you have to explain that you got sick from stealing someone else's food. My new roommate is great, and more importantly, my groceries actually last as long as they're supposed to now. That story's over, and honestly, the patience required to document months of theft just to serve the perfect revenge cake is incredible. The itemized bill and HR threat were brilliant moves that turned the tables completely. Some people really don't understand that actions have consequences until those consequences have a taste of wasabi and cayenne pepper. Let's move to our next story, which involves a neighbor who thought they could get away with some pretty outrageous behavior until someone decided to fight fire with fire. My neighbor Patricia has always been what I'd politely call particular about her property. She's the type of person who measures grass height with a ruler and leaves passive-aggressive notes about parking that's technically legal, but not to her personal standards. I'd been tolerating her quirks for about 2 years when she decided to escalate things dramatically. It started when I got a new puppy, a golden retriever named Buster, who was about 4 months old when this all went down. Buster is incredibly well behaved, never barks excessively, and I always clean up after him immediately. But Patricia apparently decided that having a dog next door was somehow affecting her property values. The first sign of trouble was when she started complaining to the homeowners association about excessive pet noise during what she called quiet hours. The thing is, our HOA doesn't have specific quiet hours for pets, and Buster rarely barks except when someone comes to the door. But Patricia was filing formal complaints twice a week, demanding documentation of when my dog made noise and what I was doing to address it. Then she installed a decibel meter pointed toward my yard and started keeping a log of any sounds coming from my property. She'd record things like dog walking across deck, 45 decibels, and owner talking to dog in backyard, 38 decibels. Or she actually presented this log to the HOA as evidence that I was disturbing the peace. The situation got ridiculous when Patricia started throwing things over the fence whenever Buster was outside. First, it was just small pebbles, which I thought might be accidental. Then she escalated to actually throwing larger rocks, and even spraying water from her hose whenever she saw him in the yard. I caught her doing this and asked her to stop, but she claimed she was just maintaining her property and had every right to do whatever she wanted on her side of the fence. That's when I decided Patricia needed a taste of her own medicine, but I was going to be much more strategic about it. I did some research and discovered that Patricia had been violating several HOA guidelines that she was apparently unaware of. Her garden shed was 6 inches closer to the property line than regulations allowed. She had an unauthorized satellite dish on her roof that wasn't properly permitted, and most importantly, she'd been operating what was essentially a small business out of her home, selling handmade crafts online without declaring it to the HOA as required. I started documenting everything with the same obsessive detail Patricia had been using against me. I measured her shed placement with a surveyor's tape and took photos from multiple angles. I researched the satellite dish installation requirements and confirmed hers didn't meet the guidelines. I even found her online craft business and documented her sales volume and shipping activities. But I didn't stop there. I also discovered that Patricia's beloved garden, which she was incredibly proud of, was actually extending about 8 inches onto community property. She'd been maintaining this area for years, apparently assuming it was part of her lot, but the actual property markers showed she was technically trespassing on HOA common space. I compiled all of this information into a detailed report, complete with measurements, photographs, and relevant HOA policy citations. Then I submitted formal complaints for each violation, using the exact same language and format Patricia had been using against me. The HOA response was swift and comprehensive. Patricia received violation notices for her shed placement, unauthorized satellite installation, unpermitted business operation, and encroachment on common property. Each violation came with specific deadlines for correction and potential fines for non-compliance. Patricia was furious and immediately suspected I was behind the complaints. She confronted me in my driveway, demanding to know if I'd tattled to the HOA about her property. I calmly explained that I'd simply been documenting property issues with the same thoroughness she'd been using to document my dog's behaviour. I told her I believed in following all community guidelines and ensuring everyone was held to the same standards. The best part was when Patricia tried to argue that her violations were different because they were unintentional and she'd been grandfathered in by previous HOA boards. I pointed out that ignorance of the rules wasn't typically considered a valid excuse and that if she wanted to appeal the violations, she should follow the proper procedures outlined in the HOA handbook. Patricia had to spend over $2,000 moving her shed, removing her satellite dish, and properly registering her business with the community association. She also had to restore the 8 inches of common property she'd been maintaining, which meant replanting that entire section of her garden. During this process, she stopped harassing me and Buster entirely. She was too busy dealing with her own property issues to worry about documenting my dog's perfectly normal behaviour. The rock throwing and water spraying stopped immediately, and she even started avoiding eye contact when we saw each other outside. The situation reached its perfect conclusion when Patricia tried to file one final complaint about Buster's barking. The HOA board, who were now very familiar with Patricia's pattern of excessive complaints and her recent violation history, dismissed her complaint and actually issued her a warning about filing frivolous reports. Patricia moved away about 6 months later, apparently deciding that our neighbourhood wasn't the right fit for her particular management style. The new neighbours are lovely people who actually enjoy seeing Buster play in the yard. That story is over. The poetic justice of someone getting buried under their own system of petty complaints is absolutely beautiful. Patricia learned the hard way that if you're going to weaponize HOA rules against your neighbours, you better make sure your own property is completely compliant first. Sometimes the best revenge is simply holding people to their own standards. Our next story takes us into the workplace, where someone discovered their colleague was taking credit for their work and decided that turnabout is fair play. I work in marketing for a mid-sized tech company, and for the past year, I'd been dealing with a co-worker named Brandon, who had a serious problem with taking credit for other people's ideas. Brandon was one of those smooth-talking guys who was great at presenting, but terrible at actually doing the creative work. He'd been coasting on other people's efforts for months before I became his primary target. It started small. I'd mention an idea in a team meeting, and Brandon would later present it as his own to our manager. When I called him out privately, he'd claim he'd been thinking about the same thing and that great minds think alike. But it escalated when he started taking credit for entire campaigns I'd developed. The breaking point came when I spent 3 weeks developing a comprehensive social media strategy for a major product launch. I'd done market research, created content calendars, designed mock-ups, and even written sample copy for all the posts. I was planning to present it to the leadership team the following Monday. That Friday, I got sick with food poisoning and had to call in. When I came back on Monday, I discovered that Brandon had presented my entire strategy to the leadership team, claiming he'd been working on it for weeks. He even used my exact slides and copy, just with his name on them instead of mine. The leadership team was impressed, and Brandon received recognition for what they called innovative thinking and strategic vision. Meanwhile, I had to sit there and watch him accept praise for work I'd done, while suffering through stomach cramps and fever all weekend. When I confronted Brandon privately, he had the audacity to suggest we'd been collaborating on the project and that he'd simply taken initiative when I was unavailable. He said that in team environments, it's sometimes unclear who contributes what, and that I should be happy the project was moving forward successfully. That's when I realized Brandon needed to learn a very public lesson about intellectual property and professional ethics. I started planning my revenge carefully. First, I gathered evidence of all the times Brandon had stolen credit for my work. I had email drafts, file creation timestamps, and even some recorded team meetings where you could hear me proposing ideas that Brandon later claimed as his own. But more importantly, I started feeding Brandon false information to set him up for a spectacular failure. I began working on what appeared to be a major campaign proposal for our biggest client. I made sure Brandon knew I was working on something important by leaving documents visible on my desk and taking calls about the big presentation where he could overhear. I even mentioned to a trusted co-worker that I was developing a game-changing strategy that could revolutionize how we approached this particular client. The fake campaign I created was professionally presented, but fundamentally flawed in ways that would only become obvious to someone with deep knowledge of the client's actual needs and restrictions. I included strategies that violated the client's stated budget constraints, proposed partnerships with competitors they'd explicitly rejected, and suggested messaging that directly contradicted their brand guidelines. I made sure to leave this fake presentation on my computer over a long weekend when I knew Brandon would have access to the office. Sure enough, when I came back, I could tell from my computer's browser history that he'd accessed my files and spent considerable time reviewing the presentation. 2 weeks later, Brandon requested a meeting with the leadership team to present what he called a revolutionary approach to our biggest client relationship. I made sure to attend this meeting as a regular team member, not indicating that I had any special knowledge of what he was about to present. Brandon's presentation started strong. He was confident and articulate as always, and the leadership team seemed engaged initially. But as he got into the specifics of the strategy, I could see confusion starting to spread across their faces. The client's account manager was the first to speak up. She pointed out that the proposed budget was nearly 3 times what the client had allocated, and that several of the suggested partnerships were with companies the client considered direct competitors. The creative director noted that the messaging strategy directly contradicted brand guidelines they'd spent months developing with the client. Brandon tried to defend the proposal, but it became increasingly clear that he had no understanding of the client's actual needs or constraints. When pressed for details about his research process, he couldn't provide specifics. When asked about alternative approaches, he had no backup plans. The meeting ended with the leadership team expressing serious concerns about Brandon's understanding of our client relationships and strategic thinking abilities. The account manager specifically mentioned that presenting this proposal to the client would have been professionally embarrassing and could have damaged our relationship with them. After the meeting, I was asked to stay behind. The leadership team wanted to know if I had any insights into why Brandon's usually solid work had been so far off the mark. I explained that while I couldn't speak to Brandon's research process, I'd be happy to develop an alternative proposal that actually addressed the client's stated needs and constraints. Within a week, I'd presented a real strategy that the leadership team loved and the client approved enthusiastically. The contrast between my thorough, client-focused approach and Brandon's disconnected proposal was stark and obvious to everyone involved. Brandon was quietly moved to a different team where his work could be more closely supervised. He never directly confronted me about the fake presentation, but I could tell from his behaviour that he suspected I'd set him up. The beautiful part was that he couldn't complain without admitting he'd stolen what he thought was my work. My manager later told me that the incident had raised serious questions about Brandon's judgment and integrity, and that my ability to quickly develop a successful alternative strategy had demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking they wanted to see more of. I got promoted 3 months later, partly based on the success of that client campaign and my demonstrated ability to understand complex client needs. Brandon left the company about 6 months after that, apparently deciding that our workplace culture wasn't the right fit for his working style. That story is over. The level of strategic thinking required to create a fake presentation that would expose someone's theft while demonstrating your own competence is genuinely impressive. Brandon learned that when you steal someone's work, you better make sure you actually understand what you're stealing. Sometimes the best trap is one that looks exactly like what someone wants to take. Let's dive into our next story, which shows what happens when someone tries to take advantage of a person's generosity and discovers that kindness has limits. I used to be the kind of person who would bend over backward to help anyone who asked. My friends always said I was too generous for my own good, but I genuinely enjoyed being able to make other people's lives easier. That philosophy worked fine until I met my former friend Melissa, who taught me that some people will take everything you're willing to give and then demand more. Melissa and I became friends when she started working at the coffee shop I frequented every morning. She was going through a rough patch after her divorce, struggling to make ends meet with her part-time barista job while taking night classes to finish her degree. I felt bad for her situation and started leaving bigger tips, bringing her lunch occasionally and offering rides when her car was in the shop. Over time, our friendship developed outside of the coffee shop. Melissa was funny and seemed genuinely appreciative of the help I provided. When she mentioned struggling with rent, I offered to lend her money to get caught up. When her laptop died during finals week, I let her borrow mine for 2 weeks while she saved up for a replacement. When she needed professional clothes for job interviews, I took her shopping and covered the cost. Each time Melissa needed help, she'd promise to pay me back or return the favour when she got back on her feet. She was always grateful and made it clear that my generosity meant everything to her. I genuinely cared about her success and was happy to invest in helping a friend achieve her goals. The problem was that Melissa's requests kept getting bigger and more frequent. What started as occasional small favours evolved into regular expectations for financial support, transportation, and personal assistance. She'd text me at all hours, asking for rides, money, or help with various crises that always seemed urgent and unavoidable. When Melissa finally graduated and got a decent job, I expected the constant requests to slow down. Instead, they intensified. She'd ask me to cover dinner bills because she was still adjusting to her new budget. She'd need loans for security deposits, car repairs, and medical bills. She'd want me to help her move apartments, watch her cat when she travelled, and provide free graphic design work for her side projects. The breaking point came when Melissa asked if she could stay at my house for a few days while her new apartment was being prepared. Those few days stretched into 3 weeks, during which she treated my home like a free hotel. She'd invite friends over without asking, leave messes for me to clean up, and use my car whenever she felt like it. When I finally asked Melissa about her timeline for moving out, she got defensive and said she thought I enjoyed having company. She pointed out that she'd been helping with groceries and utilities, though her contributions were minimal compared to what she was consuming. She said she'd expected more understanding from someone who claimed to be her friend. That's when I realised Melissa had never actually viewed our relationship as friendship. To her, I was a resource to be managed and exploited. Every conversation we'd ever had was her assessing what she could get from me next. Her gratitude was performative, designed to keep me providing whatever she needed. I told Melissa she needed to find alternative housing by the end of the week. Her response was to accuse me of being selfish and abandoning her when she needed support. She said she'd thought I was different from other people, but that I was just another fair-weather friend who only cared about helping when it was convenient. When Melissa realised I was serious about the deadline, she shifted tactics and started trying to guilt-trip me. She brought up every favour I'd ever done for her, claiming that kicking her out would waste all the investment I'd made in her success. She said she'd always planned to pay me back for everything once she was more established, but now she wouldn't be able to because I was forcing her into financial crisis. Melissa moved out that weekend, but not before trying one final manipulation. She left a note saying she was disappointed to learn what kind of person I really was, and that she hoped I'd be happy knowing I'd chosen money over friendship. She said she'd learned a valuable lesson about trusting people who only help others to feel superior. The real lesson came a few weeks later when I ran into Melissa's former co-worker from the coffee shop. She mentioned that Melissa had been telling everyone a very different version of our friendship. According to Melissa's story, I'd been possessive and controlling, demanding constant attention and getting jealous when she tried to become independent. The co-worker also mentioned that Melissa had been pulling the same routine with several other people. She'd develop friendships with generous individuals, slowly escalate her requests for help, and then move on to new targets when her current benefactors set boundaries. Apparently, I wasn't her first or last victim. Looking back, I realised that Melissa had been incredibly strategic in how she'd cultivated our relationship. She'd shared just enough personal information to make me feel emotionally invested while constantly presenting new crises that required immediate assistance. She'd always framed her requests as temporary emergency help, not ongoing support expectations. The most manipulative part was how she'd made me feel special for being willing to help when others wouldn't. She'd constantly tell me I was different from everyone else, more caring and understanding. It made me want to live up to that image by continuing to provide whatever she needed. I learned to be more careful about distinguishing between people who genuinely need help and people who are professionally helpless. Real friendship involves reciprocity and respect for boundaries. When someone consistently takes without giving back and gets angry when you try to establish limits, that's not friendship at all. Melissa taught me that being generous doesn't mean being available for unlimited exploitation. Some people will drain every resource you're willing to share and then blame you for not giving more. Setting boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining relationships that are actually healthy and sustainable. That story is over. The calculated way Melissa escalated from small favours to basically moving in shows, this was a practiced routine, not desperation. She'd clearly perfected the art of finding generous people and systematically bleeding them dry while making them feel guilty for having boundaries. The fake gratitude and manipulation tactics are textbook emotional vampirism. Some people mistake kindness for weakness and learn too late that patient people can have very firm limits. When someone makes you feel bad for not giving them everything they want, that's your sign to run. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their business partner had been setting them up to fail from the very beginning. My business partner Troy and I started a small digital marketing consultancy about 2 years ago. We'd known each other since college and had always talked about working together someday. When we both got laid off from our corporate jobs within a few months of each other, it seemed like the perfect opportunity to make that dream a reality. Initially, our partnership seemed ideal. Troy handled the sales and client relationships, while I focused on strategy development and campaign execution. We split everything 50-50 and made decisions together about major business directions. For the first year, things went smoothly, and we were both optimistic about our future prospects. The problems started when we landed our biggest client, a regional restaurant chain that wanted a complete digital overhaul. The contract was worth more than all our previous work combined and represented a major step forward for our business. I was excited about the opportunity to prove what our small company could accomplish. Troy insisted on handling all direct communication with this client, saying his relationship building skills would be crucial for managing such an important account. He said I should focus on developing the best possible strategies while he made sure the client felt confident in our team's capabilities. I threw myself into the project, working late nights and weekends to create comprehensive plans for their social media presence, email marketing campaigns, and website redesign. I researched their competitors, analysed their target demographics, and developed detailed timelines for implementation. Throughout this process, Troy would relay feedback from the client that seemed increasingly critical of my work. According to him, they were concerned about my strategic approach, questioned my understanding of their brand, and wanted significant revisions to almost everything I'd developed. I was confused because my strategies were based on proven methodologies that had worked well for our other clients. But Troy assured me that this client had very specific needs and that I should trust his interpretation of their feedback since he was handling all the direct communication. After weeks of revisions and adjustments based on Troy's reported client feedback, I was feeling frustrated and starting to doubt my own abilities. Every suggestion I made seemed to miss the mark, and Troy was increasingly positioning himself as the one who truly understood what the client wanted. That's when I decided to reach out to the client directly to clarify some technical questions about their website integration needs. I figured a brief phone call could help me understand their requirements better and improve my strategic recommendations. The conversation with the client's marketing director completely changed my understanding of the situation. She mentioned how impressed they'd been with my initial strategy presentation and asked when we'd be moving forward with implementation. She said they'd been waiting weeks for us to begin executing the plans they'd already approved. I was confused and asked what she meant by approved plans. She explained that Troy had presented my original strategies to their team a month earlier, and they'd given enthusiastic approval for everything I'd developed. They'd been expecting to see progress on implementation, not additional revisions. When I mentioned the extensive feedback and revision requests Troy had been relaying, the marketing director seemed genuinely puzzled. She said they'd provided only minor suggestions and had been clear that they wanted to move forward quickly with the original plans. That's when I realised Troy had been lying to me for weeks about client feedback. While I'd been spinning my wheels on unnecessary revisions, he'd been presenting my original work to the client as his own strategic thinking. He'd been taking credit for my strategies while making me believe they were inadequate. I dug deeper and discovered the full scope of Troy's deception. He'd been telling the client that he was the primary strategist on our team and that I was more of a junior implementation specialist. He'd positioned all of my creative work as his own thinking, while describing me as someone who helped execute his vision. Even worse, Troy had been negotiating a separate consulting agreement with the client for ongoing strategic guidance that would pay him directly rather than going through our shared business. He'd essentially been using our partnership and my work as a launching pad for his own competing consultancy. When I confronted Troy with evidence of his deception, he initially tried to deny everything. When that became impossible, he shifted to claiming that he'd been trying to protect our business relationship by managing client expectations. He said my strategies needed his relationship skills to be properly sold and that we were both benefiting from his approach. I pointed out that he'd been actively undermining me while taking credit for my work, and that his separate consulting deal violated every aspect of our partnership agreement. Troy responded by saying that business partnerships required different skills and that he'd been contributing more value through client relationship management. That's when I decided Troy needed to learn about the consequences of betraying a business partner who controlled all the actual work product. I immediately called the client and explained the full situation. I provided documentation showing that I'd developed all the strategies Troy had been presenting as his own work. I showed them timestamps on my files, draft versions with my revision notes, and research materials I'd compiled independently. The client was furious about being deceived and immediately terminated both our original contract and Troy's separate consulting agreement. They said they couldn't work with a company where partners were actively competing against each other and misrepresenting their respective contributions. But I wasn't done. I also reached out to all of our other clients to clarify exactly who had been responsible for developing their strategic plans. Several of them were shocked to learn that work they'd been crediting to Troy had actually been developed by me. The revelation destroyed Troy's credibility in our local business community. Word spread quickly that he'd been taking credit for his partner's work while trying to steal clients through deceptive practices. His reputation for relationship building became a reputation for manipulation and dishonesty. Troy tried to salvage the situation by claiming I was being vindictive and destroying our business out of jealousy. But the documentation I'd provided to clients made it clear that he'd been systematically deceiving everyone about our respective roles and contributions. Our partnership dissolved within a month, and I kept all the intellectual property since I could prove I'd developed it independently. Troy tried to start his own consultancy, but his damaged reputation made it nearly impossible to attract clients who trusted him. Meanwhile, I was able to rebuild relationships with our former clients based on honest representation of my work and capabilities. Several of them hired me directly, and my solo consultancy has been more successful than our partnership ever was. The irony is that Troy's deception ultimately gave me everything he'd been trying to steal. By forcing me to document and prove my contributions, he'd helped me build a portfolio that clearly demonstrated my value independent of his relationship management skills. Troy learned that trust is the foundation of any business partnership, and once that trust is broken, no amount of smooth talking can repair the damage. You can't build a sustainable business on deception, especially when your success depends on stealing credit from the person who's actually doing the work. That story is over. Troy essentially spent months creating evidence of his own fraud while thinking he was being clever. The beautiful irony is that his deception forced the narrator to document everything, which ultimately proved their value and destroyed his credibility completely. When you try to steal someone's work while making them think they're failing, you better make sure they don't have access to the people you're lying to. Some betrayals are so calculated, they become self-destroying when exposed. Let's move into our next story, which involves someone who thought they could manipulate their way out of consequences until they met someone who was better at their own game. My ex-girlfriend Caroline thought she was a master manipulator until she tried her tricks on someone who could see right through her games. Caroline and I dated for about 6 months, and during that time, I watched her systematically lie to friends, family, and co-workers to get whatever she wanted. She had this incredible ability to make people feel sorry for her, while simultaneously making them feel like helping her was their idea. Caroline's specialty was creating elaborate sob stories that were just believable enough to trigger people's sympathy without being so dramatic that they seemed fake. She'd tell her boss that her grandmother was sick when she wanted time off, then tell her friends that work was being unreasonable about her family situation. She'd borrow money from multiple people for the same fake emergency, keeping careful track of which story she'd told to whom. What really bothered me was how Caroline would target people's specific weaknesses. She knew that her co-worker Lisa was insecure about being liked, so she'd constantly ask for favors while praising Lisa for being such a good friend. She knew that her neighbor Tom felt guilty about his divorce, so she'd hint that she reminded him of his daughter and needed a father figure in her life. I started calling Caroline out on these manipulations, but she'd always have an explanation that made me feel like I was being paranoid or unsympathetic. She'd say I didn't understand how hard it was to be a woman in the world, or that I was jealous of her social skills. She made me feel guilty for questioning her when she was just trying to survive. The beginning of the end came when Caroline set her sights on my friend Raymond, who owned a successful catering business. She'd heard me mention that Raymond was generous and had helped friends get back on their feet before. Caroline started showing up wherever she knew Raymond would be, slowly building what seemed like a natural friendship. Caroline told Raymond that she'd always dreamed of starting her own event planning business, but couldn't afford the startup costs. She mentioned that she had clients lined up, but needed a catering partner to make her vision reality. She made it sound like she was offering him a business opportunity rather than asking for help. Raymond was intrigued and agreed to cater Caroline's first few events at cost, with the understanding that they'd split the profits once her business was established. Caroline was thrilled and immediately started planning what she described as a launch party for her new company. What Raymond didn't know was that Caroline had no actual clients and no real business plan. She'd invented the entire scenario to get free catering for a party she wanted to throw for herself. She'd been telling everyone that a successful businessman was sponsoring her launch party, making herself look important and connected. Caroline spent weeks planning this elaborate party, inviting everyone she knew and promoting it on social media as a professional networking event. She designed fake business cards and created a website with stock photos and copied content. She even rented a venue and hired a photographer to document her fake success. The party was scheduled for a Saturday evening, and Raymond had prepared food for about 60 people based on Caroline's guest count. He'd invested his own money in high-quality ingredients and had his staff work overtime to make sure everything was perfect for what he thought was a legitimate business launch. That's when I decided Caroline needed to learn that manipulation has consequences when you target the wrong person. I knew Raymond well enough to understand that he valued honesty above everything else. His catering business was built on trust and reliable partnerships. If he discovered that Caroline had been lying to him from the beginning, he wouldn't just be angry about the money, he'd be furious about the professional embarrassment. I also knew that Caroline had been careless about keeping her stories straight because she'd gotten overconfident about her manipulation skills. She'd told different versions of her business plan to different people, and the details didn't match up when you compared them. The Friday before Caroline's party, I invited Raymond for coffee and casually mentioned some inconsistencies I'd noticed in Caroline's business description. I asked innocent questions about her client base and timeline that made Raymond start thinking more carefully about their arrangement. Raymond is a smart businessman, and once he started looking critically at Caroline's claims, the holes became obvious. He realized that Caroline had never provided specific client information, never shown him actual contracts, and had been vague about every concrete detail of her supposed business. Raymond did some investigating and quickly discovered that Caroline's business registration was fake. Her website content was plagiarized, and several of the testimonials she'd shown him were from companies that didn't exist. He realized he'd been completely deceived and that his catering work was essentially funding Caroline's personal party. But instead of confronting Caroline directly, Raymond decided to let her dig her own grave deeper. Saturday evening arrived, and Caroline's party was in full swing. She'd invited everyone she knew, plus their friends, and was basking in the attention and admiration. People were impressed by the beautiful venue, the amazing food, and Caroline's apparent success as an entrepreneur. Caroline spent the evening networking and accepting congratulations on her business launch. She handed out her fake business cards and talked about her expansion plans. She even gave a speech thanking everyone for supporting her dream and promising that this was just the beginning of her success. About halfway through the party, Raymond asked if he could make an announcement. Caroline was delighted, thinking he was going to publicly endorse their partnership or praise her business acumen. She called for everyone's attention and introduced Raymond as her catering partner and business mentor. Raymond stood up with a big smile and began talking about the importance of honesty in business relationships. He said that successful partnerships required trust, transparency, and mutual respect. He talked about how much he valued working with ethical entrepreneurs who shared his commitment to integrity. Then Raymond explained that he'd recently discovered that someone had been misrepresenting their business situation to take advantage of his generosity. He said that this person had invented clients, falsified documents, and created an elaborate fiction to get free services from his company. The room started getting uncomfortable as people realized this wasn't going to be the endorsement they'd expected. Caroline's face went white, but she couldn't interrupt without making things worse. Raymond continued by saying that he believed in giving people chances to come clean about their mistakes. He said he was going to ask some specific questions about Caroline's business, and if she answered honestly, they could work together to resolve the situation professionally. Then Raymond started asking Caroline to provide details about her client contracts, her business registration numbers, and her expansion timeline. Every question was designed to expose her lies in front of everyone who'd been impressed by her fake success. Caroline tried to deflect and make excuses, but Raymond kept pressing for specific information that she couldn't provide because it didn't exist. Within minutes, it became clear to everyone at the party that Caroline had been lying about having a business at all. The humiliation was complete when Raymond announced that he'd be donating the cost of the evening's catering to a legitimate small business development non-profit, since it was clear that no actual business had been launched that evening. Caroline's party emptied out quickly as guests realized they'd been used as props in an elaborate deception. The people who'd been impressed by her success felt embarrassed about being fooled. The people who'd been considering hiring her services realized they'd narrowly avoided being scammed. Caroline tried to salvage the situation by claiming that Raymond was jealous of her success and trying to sabotage her business. But with no evidence of any actual business and a room full of witnesses to her inability to answer basic questions about her supposed clients, her credibility was completely destroyed. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Word spread quickly through our social circle about Caroline's elaborate deception. People started comparing notes and realizing that many of Caroline's other stories had been lies as well. Her reputation for manipulation became common knowledge, and people started warning each other about her tactics. Caroline's social media presence, which had been carefully curated to support her fake business narrative, became evidence of her deception. People screenshot her posts and shared them as examples of how she'd been lying about her professional success. Most importantly, Caroline lost access to the network of people she'd been manipulating. Once everyone knew about her willingness to create elaborate deceptions for personal gain, they stopped trusting anything she said. Her manipulation tactics became ineffective because people were watching for them. Raymond told me later that he'd never seen someone self-destruct so completely. Caroline had worked so hard to create an impressive facade that when it collapsed, the fall was devastating. She'd invested so much in maintaining her lies that she had no backup plan when the truth came out. Caroline moved to a different city about 2 months later, apparently deciding that her reputation in our area was beyond repair. I heard through mutual friends that she'd tried to reinvent herself somewhere new, but her social media history and the connected nature of professional networks made it difficult to completely escape her past. The whole experience taught me that manipulators often become victims of their own success. Caroline had gotten so good at lying that she'd started believing she could deceive anyone about anything. When she finally targeted someone who was smarter and more experienced than her previous victims, her entire system collapsed. Raymond showed me that the best way to deal with manipulation isn't always direct confrontation. Sometimes the most effective response is to create a situation where the manipulator exposes themselves. Caroline destroyed her own credibility more thoroughly than anyone else could have done. That story is over. Caroline basically orchestrated her own public execution by getting too greedy and targeting someone who actually knew how to investigate her claims. The poetic justice of her fake business launch party becoming the venue for her complete professional humiliation is absolutely perfect. When you build your entire social presence on lies, it only takes one person asking the right questions to bring the whole thing crashing down. She learned that manipulation works until you meet someone who's better at strategy than you are. This next story comes from someone who discovered that their landlord had been taking advantage of multiple tenants and decided it was time for some collective action. I'd been renting a small apartment in an older building for about 18 months when I started noticing some concerning patterns in how our landlord Frank operated his property. At first, I thought I was just dealing with typical landlord issues, but as I got to know my neighbours better, I realised Frank was running what amounted to a systematic scam on his tenants. The building had 12 units, and Frank managed everything himself without going through a property management company. He preferred tenants who were young, new to the area, or otherwise unlikely to know their rights, or have the resources to challenge questionable practices. My first red flag should have been how eager Frank was to rent to me, despite my limited credit history and the fact that I was new to the city. He made the process incredibly easy, asking for just first month's rent and a security deposit. No additional fees or complicated paperwork. At the time, I thought I was getting a great deal. The problem started small. Frank would enter apartments without proper notice, claiming he was checking for maintenance issues or showing the unit to prospective tenants. He'd schedule repairs during inconvenient times and then charge tenants fees if they weren't available to provide access. Frank also had a creative approach to security deposits. When tenants moved out, he'd find extensive damage that required expensive repairs, often claiming the entire deposit plus additional money. He'd present invoices from contractors for work that seemed overpriced and sometimes completely unnecessary. I started paying attention to Frank's tactics when my neighbour Amy moved out after her lease expired. Amy had kept the apartment in excellent condition, but Frank claimed she owed him $800 beyond her security deposit for carpet replacement, wall repainting, and deep cleaning. The invoices he provided seemed suspicious, but Amy was starting a new job in another state and didn't have time to fight the charges. That's when I started talking to other tenants about their experiences with Frank. What I discovered was a pattern of behaviour that was clearly illegal, but difficult for individual tenants to challenge effectively. Frank was keeping security deposits from nearly every tenant who moved out, regardless of the actual condition of their apartments. He'd use the same contractors for all repairs, and their invoices were consistently inflated compared to market rates for similar work. Frank was also charging illegal fees for things like lease processing, key replacement, and maintenance requests. He'd bury these charges in lease agreements that most tenants didn't read carefully, and he'd present them as standard industry practices. Most concerning was Frank's habit of entering apartments without proper notice, and then using information he gathered during these illegal entries to create pretexts for additional charges. He'd photograph normal wear and tear, then claim it was tenant-caused damage when people moved out. I realised that Frank was counting on tenant turnover and the fact that most renters wouldn't have the knowledge or resources to challenge his practices in court. He was making thousands of extra dollars per year by systematically violating tenant rights across all his properties. That's when I decided Frank needed to face some collective consequences for his illegal landlord practices. I started by researching tenant rights law and documenting every interaction I'd had with Frank that seemed questionable. I took photos of my apartment's condition, saved all communications, and started keeping a detailed log of his illegal entries and questionable practices. But more importantly, I organised the other tenants in our building to share information about their experiences with Frank. We created a group chat where people could document illegal entries, share suspicious invoices, and compare notes about questionable charges. What we discovered was even worse than I'd suspected. Frank had been stealing security deposits from tenants for years, often using the same fake damage claims and inflated repair invoices repeatedly. He'd charged multiple tenants for the same carpet replacement and had billed people for repainting that had never actually been done. We also discovered that Frank was violating city housing codes in multiple ways that could result in serious fines if reported to the proper authorities. He'd been avoiding required safety inspections, ignoring maintenance requests that were legally mandated, and failing to provide proper documentation for various charges. Armed with this information, we developed a coordinated response strategy. Instead of individual tenants fighting Frank's practices alone, we decided to present a unified challenge that would be much harder for him to dismiss or manipulate. First, we filed a group complaint with the city's housing authority documenting all of Frank's code violations and illegal practices. We provided photos, invoices, lease agreements, and testimony from multiple tenants showing a clear pattern of systematic violations. Second, we contacted a local legal aid organisation that specialised in tenant rights cases. They were very interested in our documentation and agreed to represent the group in pursuing recovery of illegally withheld deposits and fees. Third, we started a public information campaign to warn other potential tenants about Frank's practices. We posted detailed reviews on rental websites, shared information in local Facebook groups, and contacted nearby colleges to make sure their housing offices knew about Frank's building. Frank's initial response was to try the same intimidation tactics he'd used successfully with individual tenants in the past. He sent threatening letters about lease violations and tried to pressure people into dropping their complaints. But Frank wasn't prepared for dealing with organised tenants who had done their legal homework. Every threat he made was documented and shared with our legal representation. Every attempt at retaliation was reported to the housing authority as additional evidence of his illegal practices. The city housing inspection was devastating for Frank. Inspectors found numerous code violations that required immediate correction and resulted in substantial fines. Frank was required to bring the building up to code within 60 days or face additional penalties and potential closure. The legal case was even more damaging. Our attorney was able to prove systematic theft of security deposits going back several years. Frank was ordered to return all illegally withheld deposits plus damages, and he faced additional penalties for the illegal fees he'd been charging. But the most effective consequence was the damage to Frank's ability to continue his scam operation. Our public information campaign made it nearly impossible for him to find new tenants who weren't aware of his practices. His building sat mostly empty for months because anyone who researched him online would discover the extensive documentation of his illegal behaviour. Frank eventually sold the building to a legitimate property management company rather than deal with the ongoing legal and financial consequences of his actions. The new owners honoured all existing leases and implemented proper tenant relations practices. Most of the tenants who'd been scammed by Frank received full restitution for their stolen deposits and illegal fees. The legal aid organisation used our case as an example in their tenant education programs, helping other renters recognise and respond to similar illegal practices. The experience taught me that slumlords like Frank rely on tenants being isolated and uninformed about their rights. When renters organise and share information, landlords can't get away with systematic violations that would be impossible to defend in court. Frank learned that stealing from tenants might work when you're dealing with individuals who don't know their rights, but it becomes unsustainable when you're facing organised tenants with legal representation and documentation of your crimes. That story is over. Frank basically created a tenant union against himself by being so consistently awful that everyone had to work together just to get their stolen money back. The beauty of collective action is that landlords who prey on individual tenants suddenly find themselves completely outmatched when those tenants start comparing notes and organising responses. When your business model depends on people not knowing their rights, it falls apart the moment they get educated and start working together. These revenge stories show us that karma doesn't always work on its own timeline, but sometimes it gets a little help from people who refuse to be victims. Whether it's a roommate learning about consequences through creative cooking, a manipulative co-worker getting trapped by their own theft, or a slumlord facing organised tenant action, the common thread is that patient, strategic responses often deliver the most satisfying justice. The best revenge stories aren't about getting even through cruelty or violence. They're about using intelligence, documentation, and sometimes a little creativity to make sure that people face appropriate consequences for their actions. When someone consistently takes advantage of others, there's something deeply satisfying about watching them get outsmarted by the very people they thought they could exploit. Sometimes, the most satisfying revenge isn't about getting back at someone immediately. It's about waiting for the perfect moment when their own actions create the ideal opportunity for justice. These next stories show what happens when patience meets opportunity, and the results are absolutely beautiful. Our next story comes from someone who discovered their sibling had been sabotaging family relationships for years and decided it was time to expose the truth. My older brother Tyler has always been what my family called the responsible one, while I was labelled as the troublemaker who couldn't get my life together. For years I accepted this dynamic, even though it never quite felt accurate. Tyler was successful, married, and seemed to have everything figured out, while I struggled through college and bounced between jobs trying to find my direction. What I didn't realise until recently was that Tyler had been actively working to maintain this narrative by sabotaging my relationships with our parents and extended family. He'd been doing it so subtly and consistently that I never connected the dots until everything came together in the most unexpected way. It started in high school when I'd get in trouble for things I didn't do or didn't remember doing. My parents would confront me about breaking curfew or leaving messes around the house, and I genuinely have no memory of these incidents. Tyler would always be there to corroborate their concerns, sadly shaking his head about his irresponsible younger sibling. In college, my parents would mention disappointments about my behaviour that confused me. They'd say I'd been rude during phone calls or had made promises I hadn't kept. When I'd try to clarify or defend myself, Tyler would gently suggest that maybe I didn't remember things clearly because of stress or partying. The pattern continued into my adult life. My parents would bring up comments I'd supposedly made about not wanting to attend family events, or mention that I'd seemed uninterested in their lives during recent conversations. Tyler would always be present during these discussions, playing the role of the concerned older brother who was worried about my attitude and choices. I started noticing that these misunderstandings always seemed to happen after Tyler had spent time with our parents, alone. But I chalked it up to coincidence and assumed I was being paranoid because I felt defensive about my family's perception of me. The situation escalated when our grandfather got sick last year. Tyler convinced our parents that I was too unreliable to help with grandfather's care, pointing to my supposed history of not following through on commitments. I was hurt that they didn't ask for my help, but Tyler assured me that he had everything handled and I shouldn't worry about it. What I didn't know was that Tyler had been intercepting my attempts to visit grandfather and had been telling our parents that I was too busy with my own life to make time for family obligations. He'd been systematically cutting me out of important family moments while making it look like it was my choice. The truth came out in the most unexpected way possible. Our grandfather had been keeping a journal during his illness, writing letters to family members that he planned to give us after he recovered. When he passed away suddenly, we found the journal while cleaning out his room. Reading grandfather's entries was devastating and enlightening. He'd written about how much he missed me and how hurt he was that I never came to visit. He'd written about Tyler's visits, during which Tyler would mention how disappointed everyone was in my selfishness and lack of family commitment. But the most shocking entries were grandfather's accounts of phone calls he'd received from someone claiming to be me. According to his journal, I'd supposedly called him several times to make excuses about why I couldn't visit, complaining about our parents and saying I was too busy to deal with family drama. I never made those phone calls, but Tyler had been impersonating me to our grandfather, creating a false narrative about my attitude and priorities. He'd been doing this for months, systematically destroying my relationship with the one family member who had always believed in me. Armed with grandfather's journal, I started investigating other incidents where my family had been disappointed in my supposed behaviour. I checked phone records, looked through old emails, and started asking specific questions about timing and details. What I discovered was a years-long campaign of manipulation and impersonation. Tyler had been making calls pretending to be me, sending emails from fake accounts that looked like mine, and even creating fake social media posts to support his narrative about my character and priorities. The fake emails were particularly sophisticated. Tyler had created accounts with slight variations of my name and had been corresponding with our parents and extended family, making complaints about family obligations and expressing attitudes that were completely unlike my actual personality. Tyler had also been intercepting and redirecting communications. He'd convinced our parents to send important family information through him because I was supposedly unreliable about responding to messages. Then he'd filter what I received, often delaying or modifying information to make me seem uninformed or uninterested. The most elaborate deception involved social media. Tyler had created fake profiles that looked like they belonged to my friends, and these fake accounts would post comments supporting his narrative about my behaviour and attitude. He'd screenshot these fake interactions and share them with family members as evidence of what people really thought about me. When I confronted Tyler with all the evidence I'd gathered, he initially tried to deny everything. When that became impossible, he shifted to claiming he'd been trying to protect the family from my negative influence. He said he'd been doing everyone a favour by managing my relationships and preventing me from hurting people with my supposed selfishness. Tyler actually tried to convince me that his manipulations had been good for me because they'd motivated me to become a better person. He said that without his interventions, I might never have developed any sense of responsibility or consideration for others. But I wasn't interested in Tyler's justifications. I was ready to show our family exactly who the real troublemaker had been all along. I compiled everything into a detailed presentation, complete with phone records, fake email accounts, screenshots of fake social media profiles, and grandfather's journal entries. I invited our parents and key family members to a meeting, telling them I had important information to share about grandfather's final months. During the presentation, I walked through Tyler's entire deception systematically. I showed them the fake emails he'd sent pretending to be me, played recordings of voicemails he'd left impersonating my voice, and demonstrated how he'd created fake social media evidence to support his narratives about my character. The most powerful moment was reading grandfather's journal entries aloud, particularly the parts where he wrote about the fake phone calls from someone pretending to be me. The pain in grandfather's words, as he described feeling abandoned by his supposedly selfish granddaughter, was heartbreaking and infuriating. My parents were devastated as they realised how thoroughly they'd been deceived. They started connecting dots about incidents over the years where they'd been disappointed in my behaviour, realising that many of these situations had been manufactured by Tyler. Tyler tried to defend himself by claiming that everything he'd done was motivated by love and concern for the family. He said he'd been trying to protect everyone from what he genuinely believed was my negative influence. But the evidence of his elaborate deceptions made it clear that his actions were calculated and malicious, not protective. The family confrontation was brutal. Tyler's wife was shocked to learn about the extent of his manipulations, and several family members expressed anger about being used as unwitting participants in his campaign against me. People started questioning other situations where Tyler had been the source of information about family conflicts or problems. Tyler's carefully constructed image as the reliable, trustworthy son completely collapsed. Family members realized that many of the problems they'd attributed to my selfishness or irresponsibility had actually been created or exaggerated by Tyler's manipulations. The aftermath was swift and comprehensive. Tyler was essentially ostracized from family gatherings and decision-making processes. People stopped trusting his accounts of situations and started verifying information independently rather than taking his word for things. My relationship with our parents improved dramatically once they understood how they'd been manipulated. They were horrified by the extent of Tyler's deceptions and felt guilty about how they'd treated me based on false information. We started rebuilding our connection based on direct communication rather than Tyler's filtered version of my thoughts and feelings. Tyler's marriage also suffered significant damage. His wife realized that if he was capable of such elaborate deceptions with his own family, she couldn't trust that he was being honest in their relationship either. They separated about 6 months later, and Tyler moved to a different state shortly afterward. The most satisfying part was reclaiming my relationship with our extended family. Once they understood that Tyler had been manipulating their perceptions of me for years, many relatives reached out to apologize and rebuild connections that had been damaged by his lies. I learned that Tyler's need to be seen as the successful, reliable son had driven him to systematically undermine me, rather than simply achieving success on his own merits. He'd been so threatened by the possibility that I might also be loved and respected by our family that he'd spent years trying to eliminate me as competition. The experience taught me to trust my own perceptions and memories, even when other people claim they're inaccurate. Tyler had been gaslighting me for so long that I'd started doubting my own experiences and accepting his version of events as truth. Most importantly, I realized that some people will go to extraordinary lengths to maintain their preferred narrative, even if it means destroying relationships and hurting people they claim to love. Tyler's manipulations weren't just lies, they were a systematic campaign designed to isolate me from my own family. That story is over. The level of calculated manipulation Tyler maintained for years is genuinely psychopathic. Creating fake email accounts and impersonating his own brother to their dying grandfather shows a complete lack of empathy or moral boundaries. The grandfather's journal entries must have been devastating to read, knowing that he died thinking his grandson had abandoned him. At least Tyler's house of lies eventually collapsed under its own weight. But the damage he caused to family relationships was irreversible. Some people are so threatened by others' potential success that they'll destroy everything rather than compete honestly. Let's move to our next story, which involves someone who discovered their friend group had been excluding them intentionally and decided to show them what real exclusion looked like. I thought I had a solid friend group until I realized they'd been systematically planning activities without me while pretending we were all still close. The discovery came about in the most humiliating way possible, but it also gave me the perfect opportunity to show them exactly what they'd been missing. Our group had been friends since college, and we'd maintained regular contact even after graduation when we all moved to different cities. There were 6 of us total, and we'd always done group chats, planned reunions, and tried to stay connected despite the distance. At least, that's what I thought was happening. The reality was that 5 of them had created a separate group chat and had been planning trips, parties, and get-togethers without including me. They'd been posting about these events on social media after the fact, always with explanations about how they'd planned things last minute, or how certain people couldn't make it. I started noticing patterns but dismissed them as coincidence. People would reference conversations I hadn't been part of, mention inside jokes that had developed without me, and sometimes seem surprised when I didn't know about events that everyone else appeared to be aware of. The truth came out when my friend Lisa accidentally sent a message meant for their secret group chat to our original group chat instead. The message said, "Remind everyone that if anyone asks, we planned this trip last week and couldn't reach him in time." The him was obviously me, and the trip was a weekend getaway they were taking to celebrate our friend Amanda's promotion. According to their story, it was a spontaneous celebration that got planned too quickly to include everyone. But Lisa's mistaken message revealed they'd been planning it for weeks and had deliberately excluded me. When I confronted the group about the secret chat and the deliberate exclusion, they initially tried to deny it. Then they shifted to claiming they'd been trying to spare my feelings because they thought I wouldn't be interested in certain activities or couldn't afford to participate in expensive trips. The explanations were insulting and obviously fabricated. They claimed they were protecting me from feeling left out by actually leaving me out. They said they thought I preferred smaller gatherings, even though I'd never expressed that preference. They suggested I seemed too busy with work to want to participate in group activities. What hurt most was realizing that this exclusion had been going on for over a year. Events I'd attributed to coincidence or poor timing had actually been carefully planned around my absence. They'd been curating a version of our friendship that existed only in my imagination. But their elaborate deception also gave me the perfect tool for revenge. If they wanted to see what deliberate exclusion looked like, I was happy to show them. I started by creating my own alternative social network within our broader circle of college friends and professional contacts. I reached out to people we all knew but hadn't stayed as close to, and began organising activities and events that would be much more interesting and exclusive than anything my former friend group had planned. The key was that I had connections and resources that the others didn't. I'd been working in event planning since graduation, so I had access to venues, tickets, and experiences that weren't available to the general public. I also had a wider network of interesting people from different industries and backgrounds. I started small by organising a dinner party for some of our college acquaintances who'd moved to my city. I made sure to post about it on social media, tagging people who would be visible to my former friend group but not including any of them in the event. Then I escalated to bigger events. I organised a weekend trip to an exclusive resort that I could access through work connections, inviting people from our extended social circle, but pointedly excluding the 5 people who'd been excluding me. I documented the entire trip on social media, making sure they could see exactly what they weren't part of. The masterpiece was when I organised a reunion for our entire college class, complete with venue, catering, and entertainment that I could arrange through my professional network. It was the kind of event that everyone would want to attend, and I made sure it was well publicised among our mutual friends and former classmates. The twist was that I sent invitations to everyone from our college class except for the 5 people who'd been excluding me from their secret group activities. When they found out about the reunion through mutual friends and realised they hadn't been invited, they were furious and confused. Lisa called me directly to ask why they hadn't been invited to the reunion. I explained that I'd thought they preferred smaller, more intimate gatherings based on their recent event planning preferences. I said I was just trying to spare their feelings by not including them in something they might not enjoy. The conversation was delicious because I was using their exact words and justifications against them. When Lisa pointed out that this was different because it was a reunion for everyone, I reminded her that I'd felt the same way about being excluded from Amanda's promotion celebration and other group activities. My former friends tried various approaches to get included in the reunion and other events I was organising. They offered to help with planning, suggested they could contribute financially, and even tried to get mutual friends to advocate for them. But I maintained that my events were carefully curated for specific groups of people, and that including them might change the dynamic I was trying to create. The irony was that my events were genuinely more successful and interesting than anything they'd been planning without me. Because I had professional connections and event planning experience, I could create experiences that were unique and memorable rather than just typical friend group gatherings. Word spread quickly through our college network about the amazing events I was organising, and people started reaching out to me directly to be included in future activities. I was becoming known as someone who threw incredible parties and had access to exclusive experiences. Meanwhile, My former friend's secret group activities started seeming petty and boring by comparison. Their weekend trips to generic vacation spots and their basic dinner parties looked pretty pathetic next to the exclusive resort weekends and professional networking events I was hosting. The final blow came when several of their secret group members started reaching out to me individually, asking to be included in my events and expressing frustration with the limited scope of activities their smaller group was planning. They were essentially defecting from the group that had excluded me to join the much more interesting social network I'd created. Within 6 months, I'd completely replaced my old friend group with a larger, more dynamic network of people who were actually interested in maintaining genuine friendships rather than playing exclusion games. My social life became significantly more active and fulfilling than it had ever been with the original group. The original 5 friends eventually reached out collectively to apologise and ask if we could rebuild our friendship. They admitted that excluding me had been wrong and that they'd realised how much they'd been missing by cutting me out of their activities, but by then I'd moved on to relationships with people who were more mature, more interesting and more committed to inclusive friendships. I politely declined their attempt at reconciliation and explained that I'd found a social circle that better matched my interests and values. The experience taught me that sometimes the best response to exclusion isn't confrontation or argument, but simply creating something better that makes the excluders realise what they've lost. My former friends learned that if you're going to cut someone out, you better make sure they don't have the ability to create alternatives that are superior to what you're offering. They also learned that exclusion works both ways, and that being on the receiving end isn't nearly as fun as being the ones doing the excluding. When they were the ones looking in from the outside, they suddenly understood how hurtful and frustrating it feels to be deliberately left out of activities you'd enjoy. That story is over. The accidental text message revealing their secret group chat is the kind of mistake that instantly destroys years of careful manipulation. Using event planning skills to create genuinely better experiences than their basic friend group activities was brilliant strategic thinking. When you exclude someone who has better connections and resources than you do, you're basically handing them the tools for perfect revenge. The fact that their own group members started defecting to join the superior social network shows how thoroughly the tables turned. Sometimes the best way to win the game is to stop playing by other people's rules and create your own version that's infinitely better. Our next story involves someone who discovered their neighbour had been stealing packages and decided to teach them a very memorable lesson about property theft. My neighbour Randy had been stealing packages from porches throughout our neighbourhood for months before I figured out it was him. Randy lived 2 houses down from me and always seemed friendly when we'd chat over the fence or run into each other at the mailbox. He'd even complained to me about his own package theft problems, expressing frustration about how inconsiderate people could be. The thefts had been escalating over the past 6 months. Multiple neighbours were reporting missing deliveries, and several people had installed security cameras after losing expensive items. The thief seemed to know exactly when packages would be delivered and would grab them within hours of arrival. I became suspicious of Randy when I realised that his house was the only one on our street that never seemed to have package theft problems. While everyone else was losing deliveries regularly, Randy's packages always seemed to arrive safely and remain untouched on his porch. My suspicion grew when I noticed Randy's sudden acquisition of items that other neighbours had reported stolen. He'd mentioned getting a great deal on electronics that matched descriptions of missing packages, or he'd be using tools that looked identical to ones that had been stolen from other porches. The confirmation came when I set up a hidden camera focused on my front porch after losing a package containing expensive skincare products. The footage showed Randy walking up my driveway at noon, checking to make sure no one was watching, and then grabbing my package before jogging back toward his house. But I didn't confront Randy immediately. Instead, I decided to set up a trap that would teach him a very specific lesson about taking things that don't belong to him. I ordered a package containing what appeared to be expensive electronics, but I modified the contents before it arrived. Inside the box, I placed a small GPS tracker, a glitter bomb device I'd made using a motor and fine craft glitter, and a Bluetooth speaker programmed to play an extremely loud and obnoxious sound at random intervals. I also included a note that said, "Congratulations, you've just stolen a package containing a tracking device, a glitter bomb, and a noisemaker. This device will activate randomly for the next week, covering you and your house with glitter while playing annoying sounds. Next time, try ordering your own packages instead of stealing them from your neighbours." I made sure to position my security camera to capture Randy's theft, and I also set up additional cameras around my property to record whatever happened next. Then I waited. Randy took the bait within hours of the package being delivered. The security footage showed him following his usual pattern, checking for witnesses before grabbing the box and hurrying back to his house with his stolen prize. The first activation happened about 2 hours later. I heard the loud, obnoxious sound coming from Randy's house, followed by shouting and what sounded like things being thrown around. The sound lasted for about 30 seconds before stopping, but I knew it would continue randomly for days. Over the next week, Randy's house became a chaotic mess. The glitter bomb had activated multiple times, covering his living spaces with fine, impossible-to-clean sparkles that stuck to everything. The random sound activations were happening at all hours, including the middle of the night, making it impossible for him to sleep or relax. Randy tried everything to stop the device. I could see him through his windows frantically searching for the source of the problems, obviously having no idea how to disable something he didn't understand. The glitter was getting on his clothes, in his hair, and throughout his house, marking him clearly as the victim of the package trap. The psychological torture was almost as effective as the physical inconvenience. Randy became paranoid and jumpy, never knowing when the next sound activation would occur. He started avoiding his own living room, where most of the glitter had been dispersed, essentially making his house partially uninhabitable. But the real genius of the plan became apparent when Randy tried to dispose of the device. Because he'd stolen the package, he couldn't complain to anyone or ask for help without admitting to theft. He was stuck dealing with the consequences entirely on his own. Randy's attempts to clean up the glitter only made things worse. The fine particles spread throughout his house every time he tried to vacuum or sweep them up. Within a few days, his entire living space was sparkling like a craft store explosion, and the effect was visible even from outside his windows. The random sound activations continued to disrupt his life in unpredictable ways. I could hear them going off during what seemed like important phone calls, while he was trying to watch television, and during his attempts to sleep. The psychological impact of never knowing when the next activation would occur was clearly wearing on him. After about 5 days, Randy was obviously desperate to make the harassment stop. He came to my house looking haggard and covered in glitter, asking if I'd noticed any strange sounds coming from his property. He said he was having some kind of electrical problem and wondered if I had any ideas about how to fix it. I played innocent and suggested he might want to call an electrician to check his wiring. I mentioned that I'd heard some odd noises, but had assumed it was construction or maintenance work. Randy looked frustrated, but couldn't explain the real situation without admitting to package theft. The final phase of my revenge came when I decided to reveal the truth to Randy and give him an opportunity to make things right with the neighbourhood. I knocked on his door while he was clearly dealing with another sound activation, and when he answered, looking completely frazzled, I handed him a printed copy of the security footage showing him stealing my package. I explained that I knew he'd been stealing packages from everyone on our street for months, and that the harassment device was my response to his theft. I told him he had 2 choices. He could either confess to the neighbourhood and make restitution for everything he'd stolen, or I could share the security footage with the police and let them handle the situation. Randy was initially angry and tried to deny the theft despite the clear video evidence. But when he realized that the harassment would continue indefinitely until he resolved the situation, he agreed to make amends with the neighbours he'd been stealing from. The neighbourhood meeting Randy organised was appropriately humiliating. He had to admit to months of package theft, while still covered in glitter, and dealing with random sound activations from the device he couldn't disable. He provided a list of items he'd stolen and offered to pay restitution to everyone he'd wronged. Most of the neighbours were more relieved than angry once they understood why their packages had been disappearing. Several people mentioned expensive items Randy had stolen, and he agreed to pay market value for everything he couldn't return in its original condition. The harassment device finally stopped after Randy had made full restitution to everyone and had publicly apologised for his theft spree. I remotely deactivated it once he'd fulfilled his obligations, though the glitter remained in his house for months afterward as a constant reminder of his crimes. Randy moved away about 3 months later, apparently deciding that living next to neighbours who knew about his theft history was too uncomfortable. The new residents are much better neighbours who actually order their own packages instead of stealing them from other people's porches. The package theft problem in our neighbourhood completely stopped after Randy left, confirming that he'd been the sole perpetrator of months of thefts. People started feeling comfortable having packages delivered again, and the atmosphere of suspicion and frustration that had been building in our community disappeared. That story is over. The weeks-long psychological torture of random glitter bombs and sound activations is absolutely diabolical, especially knowing Randy couldn't ask for help without confessing to being a thief. The image of him trying to have normal conversations while covered in craft glitter and being interrupted by obnoxious sounds is peak comedy. Package thieves never consider that their victims might be smarter and more creative than they are. Randy learned that stealing from the wrong person can turn your own home into a glittery, noisy nightmare that you can't escape. The fact that he had to confess and pay restitution while still being actively harassed by the device makes this one of the most satisfying revenge stories ever. If you enjoyed that batch as much as I did, consider subscribing as I read Reddit stories just like these every night. Anyway, take care and see you tomorrow.